I'm not double mic'd and overwhelming you all. Well, welcome everyone. Really excited to see many of you here, and I know a number of other folks are still on their way, but my name is Tim Sexton, and I serve as an Assistant Commissioner for Sustainability and Public Health at the Minnesota Department of Transportation. I am really excited to see you here today. This has been quite the saga to get this underway, and we'll my co-chair, Giovanni Cercella, will share a little bit more about that in a moment. But more than anything, I want to make sure that you all know that we're grateful for you being here today, and we're really excited about the conversations that we're going to have as part of the first conference on sustainability and emerging transportation technologies. A couple of sort of logistics to get out of the way. We don't want to take too much time from our keynote speaker, but the first thing is COVID safety measures. I think you've seen on the doors and posted around the building. Masks are very optional, encouraged. Do what makes you feel comfortable. I think you're all probably coming from places and having to navigate that, but we just want everyone to know that you're comfortable making whatever choices you want to make for your own health and safety. In terms of restrooms, if you go out the doors to the right and to the left, they're signed. I think they're pretty clear, easy to see. Exits, there's one here. There's one outside as well, out the door to the right or to the left. That's really exciting stuff to lead off with, I know. But, you know, a little bit about sort of how we see this overall the next few days going. We have, hopefully you all have a conference program. This is good to give you a general sense of how things are going to go, but I think we're all getting very used to being adaptable and changing, and you know, being consistent with that general theme. We've had a lot of recent changes to the program, so the online version should be up to date. So please reference that. But this gives you a general sense of how things are going to work. The other thing I will just call your attention to, I was asked to, you know, things are color coded by theme. So that'll give you sort of a sense of how things are organized. And we're going to lead off with these, I think, bigger conversations throughout in the morning, and then obviously, or not obviously, but we're going to go into more smaller, intimate conversations through the different tracks throughout the day. And I will say that, you know, one thing we are really excited about this particular location is that it was a bit more intimate, a bit smaller. We really think that this is a topic, these are topics that really warrant conversation. You get talked at a lot. I'm sure you're tired of webinars and Zoom calls and all of that. I think the idea is we really wanted to maximize the reason for bringing people together. So we intentionally had some smaller spaces, so, you know, some sort of a setting more like this rather than a large conference center. So we do want to encourage you all to participate, to engage, to ask questions. And then one of the things that we're trying to capture towards the end of this meeting on Thursday in our closing plenary is really to try to understand what are those questions that came up? What are those research ideas that you have? Obviously, as a TRB sponsored event, research is really important. So please keep that in mind. We're hoping that we get a lot of really good questions that come out of the conversations over the next couple of days. You know, my last piece of this opening before I turn it over to Giovanni is a thank you to the folks who participated in this. And we started these conversations back in 2018. I don't want to steal any of Giovanni's thunder, but this has been going on for a while, and we've had a lot of people engage over the last 4 years. And so I just want to give a huge thanks, first of all, to the TRB staff, especially Bill Anderson and Gary Jenkins, who have been have been here through, I think, this is our 4th attempt at this through COVID. So I think we probably win a prize of some sort. But Gary and Bill have just been instrumental and have stuck with this through the whole saga. So we're grateful for that. We also could not have done this without a planning committee, past and present. So we've had a lot of people come and go over the last 4 years. But I just wonder real quick, if you're part of the planning committee, if you could just stand up briefly and just, rather than going through the names. Thank you so much. Yes. Quite literally, folks have planned multiple sessions multiple times, and up until like Friday of last week have needed to pivot. So thank you. This is an inordinate amount of work, and we're really grateful. We also, if you look in your, one thing the paper version of this is really important for is it lists all the planning committee's members along with a whole host of volunteers. So planning committee is on page 2, volunteers on page 3. Thank you all for participating. Again, over the last 4 years, a lot of people have played important roles. Also want to thank our sponsors, the UC Davis, the National Center on Sustainable Transportation. Is that right, Giovanni? Yes, thank you. The AASHTO, who was able to bring a number of state DOT participants here who are going to play a key role as we move forward. TRB, of course, and the Minnesota Department of Transportation, who's also a bronze level sponsor. So with that, I want to turn it over to Giovanni to talk a little bit more about why we're here and a bit more of the fun, big ideas before we introduce our keynote. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. You actually did the logistics, and now I have to talk about the fun part. So it's very nice to see everybody here today, finally. As Tim said, has been a process of multiple attempts to schedule this conference and to organize it. And because of the world in which we live in, we had to postpone it multiple times and also have a lot of changes. Many of you remember the origin of this conference. In 2015, we had a previous event, a conference of sustainable transportation organized by the Transportation Research Board in Washington, D.C. It was organized and held in Washington, D.C. in 2015, and at that point, we thought it would become a series of conferences. And over time, we really evolved in our expectations about what to have there. So we didn't really want to talk only about sustainability in transportation, but the goal behind this conference was to bring together two communities, the world that is focusing on sustainability, the environment, all the issues that we need to have a pressing need to deal with. And our great keynote speaker today will talk about all the efforts that we need to do in this area in a time of very pressing needs because of climate change and global warming, all the other environmental emergencies, but also the community working on emerging transportation technology. In the United States, in TRB, we are really working on a lot of innovation in transportation, which brings opportunities, also risk, vulnerabilities, and it's very important to see also how we can combine the path of technology to be oriented towards more environmental sustainability. So that was the beginning of our efforts. The Sustainability in Transportation Committee that Tim used to lead at TRB started really this process, I think, back in 2018. The committee doesn't exist anymore. It's become a section at TRB now that handles the sustainability topics in the Transportation Research Board, met together with the community working on information communication technology, the emerging transportation technologies, and all the changes brought by new innovative technologies in transportation. And the idea was to bring here the community to discuss success stories, but also encourage change, and also what we can do next, really, to lead the path in this area. As Tim said, this has been a saga. We originally planned to meet in 2020, became a 2021 conference, then we had to postpone also during 2022 a couple of times. Originally we thought to meet in March, but apparently the pandemic lasts longer than planned. And then also we had to deal with a changing world. The transportation priorities changing. We had the COVID-19 pandemic really also restructuring the way we live, organize our activities, our relationship with technology. And then we see, the world is continuously being disrupted by international tensions, gas prices that are rising very quickly, and a lot of other things that are putting more pressure and sometimes also disrupting our priorities, because there is always something coming into the way to disrupt, whether we talk about climate change or now the priority is making sure that energy supplies will come to countries. And so that is also, the struggle in which we operate in our field. So with this, I really want to thank all of you that have been supporting this effort for this conference. We are here today, and we really plan to continue this conversation in the future. As Tim said on Thursday in the closing plenary, we'll have a discussion about the next steps in research and planning and policy on these topics, but also we expect to continue to remain engaged with you through the TRB community, but also in future events that we plan to organize regularly on these topics. And this is probably the right time to transition into really the opening of our conference, because we have a fantastic speaker with us today joining for our keynote plenary. Richard Corey is the executive officer of the California Air Resources Board, and he's a top expert in the field when it comes to talking about environmental sustainability and emerging transportation technology. He has more than 30 years of experience of working really at the forefront of bringing clean transportation regulations, pushing for innovation, and also really pushing not only the California level, but bringing innovation that later is many times also approved and implemented in Washington, D.C. and internationally. So that's really the fantastic role that his agency, and in particular under your leadership, Richard, you have been leading. And you have a great team of 1,700, I believe, engineers, economists, researchers, analysts working with him at the California Resources Board. So we're really glad that today he can really share his vision for the transportation sector and the way to make it innovative, cleaner, and more sustainable. So, Richard, we'll...
All right, thanks, Giovanni. Thanks for the kind introduction. And I'm hoping to do in the next few minutes, I'm going to time myself here, is want to provide a little bit of context for CARB, California Resources Board, and why we care about transportation and why you all care so much about transportation. A little bit of context about where we have been and where we're going as an organization and really as a state. And just to add to Giovanni's point on terms of the history of the organization, I'll do this very briefly, but I think it may be useful. So CARB was created in 1967, established by a law that Governor Ronald Reagan at the time signed in response to serious air quality issues, sound familiar, that South Coast was facing, and really demand on the part of the public to do something about it. So the agency was basically a merger of two independent agencies tasked with delivering healthy, clean air. It was about that time that the sort of the underpinnings of photochemical smog were discovered by Ari Haagen-Smit, our first chairman. And a few years later, 1970, U.S. EPA is established. Multiple iterations of the United States Federal Clean Air Act play themselves out over several years. But embedded in that, and this is really a key point, is a recognition of California's unique air quality challenges amongst the states, amongst the 50 states. And embedded in that Clean Air Act was a recognition of those challenges and a recognition of California's unique authority to regulate established motor vehicle standards. So the only state in the union that had that authority, and we've used that authority for the last 50 years and have partnered with other states and international jurisdictions why those standards have de facto become the U.S. standards and have modeled internationally as well. So why do we care so much about transportation? I talk about this all the time because it's so important. Transportation sector is responsible for 50% of our GHG emissions in California, 80% of our NOx, which leads to the formation of ozone and secondary PM, 95% of our diesel PM emissions. There is no path to attain our national ambient air quality standards or our GHG statutorily defined GHG reduction targets without transforming the transportation sector. It's not possible. You can look at the emission inventory. You do not have a path to get there without a transformation of the sector. Substantial electrification everywhere we can. We'll be talking about that, as well as efforts to reduce VMT. So we're off here. And 2022 really is, and people often talk about this, but I'm going to say why it's true. 2022 is very much going to be a transformative year for the state in many, many respects, but key, air quality and climate. And the reason for that is that we're in the process right now of completing the AB 32 scoping plan, basically the roadmap for how will it stay on target to achieve our 2030 GHG reduction targets, basically 40% below where we are today, as well as achieve carbon neutrality by 2045 or earlier. This is new. The scoping plan has been updated a few times since AB 32 was established in 2006. This is the farthest horizon going out to 2045, as well as folding in the role of natural and working lands. And traditionally, and this will be the case here, the scoping plan is a unique plan that CARB, California Air Resources Board, was given authority in AB 32 to be the state architect for the state's overall climate strategy. Now, it requires many other agencies and local action and so forth, but to pull it together, the glue was the agency to develop that plan. And I'm going to say plans aren't always implemented. I think most people know that. A lot of work can go into plans, and plans can get shelved. I don't think folks would say that based on the history since 2006 of the scoping plan. We implement it. We're an implementing agency. We're a regulatory agency. We regulate. We use two tools. We regulate motor vehicles, we regulate fuels, we regulate motor consumer products, toxics. We also use incentives to support expediting the transition of the market. Last year, our incentive budget was about $2.6 billion. So we use those dollars to facilitate these transitions. And I'll talk a little bit more about the budget going forward because it's significant as well. So this year, both the scoping plan and the SIP, State Implementation Plan, we have a significant SIP coming up in terms of how are we going to get to attainment in South Coast. Our long-term attainment, the standards get progressively tighter, and it's very difficult. Bottom line, the economy, rightly so, is growing substantially, but so is the number of vehicles, VMT. At the same time, even though the air quality has improved, we're challenged with VMT, we're challenged with fuel consumption, we're challenged with the number of motor vehicles. And just kind of a quick example of this is when the agency was created in 1967, California had about 16 million people, about 8 million vehicles. We had an economy of about 150 billion. Vehicles were driving about 50 billion miles. We exceeded the stage 1 or stage 2 ozone alerts, basically multiples of the health-based ozone standard in South Coast 200 times a year. 200 times a year. Shouldn't go outside, shouldn't exercise outside, children should play indoors, not have recess outdoors, a whole range of requirements in terms of protecting public health from basically ozone. Fast forward to today, we have 40 million people in the state. We have about 30 million vehicles, if I include heavy duty, driving about 370 billion miles, 370 billion, an economy of about 2.6 trillion, so fifth largest in the world. And we haven't had one of those stage 1 or stage 2 alerts for 15, 16 years. We still have air quality challenges. We still haven't met the national ambient air quality standards. But the progress, a vehicle today is 99% cleaner. We just have a lot more of them and they drive further. That's why we need to transition out of combustion. And the climate budget, which I'll talk about the climate budget, and we'll also be talking about VMT over the course of these remarks. So that was really fast. This slide gets to our GHG inventory on the left, and it makes a few points. One, AB 32 required that the state's greenhouse gas emissions in aggregate get back to 1990 levels by 2020. What I remember at that time was it was impossible. I remember the legislative hearings. I remember the assertions it wasn't doable. I remember the assertions there would be massive leakage, businesses fleeing the state, massive gas price increases at the time. None of that happened. And actually, we beat the target by 4 years. But what the legislature did, and rightly so, because all along this time, the IPCC and subsequent issuance of the IPCC underscored the impacts of climate change were actually worse than we had believed to be. And that obviously has continued to play out in that course. In response, SB 32 was adopted, which requires the state total GHG emissions to get to 40% below 1990, basically 40% below today by 2030. So basically a 4% year-over-year reduction, about twice the stringency of what we did in the previous leading up to about the AB 32 timeframe, so far more stringent. And the point that I made earlier, that I'm talking about GHGs, are criteria pollutant standards and the need to meet our health-based ozone standards, PM 2.5 standards. That actually, in most regions, that's actually tighter than our GHG standards. The benefit, though, is it's the same sources we're talking about. Transition out of combustion, supported by clean energy, speaks to NOx, speaks to PM 2.5, speaks to GHG. So that's the lens through which we are looking at these issues. Multiple pollutants, including community protection, which community exposure and risk in many communities up and down the state is represented by diesel PM. Some are very local, source specific, hex chrome and other sources, but diesel PM near the ports, rail yards, warehouses dominates those risks, and as it underscores the value of transitioning out of combustion in the heavy duty space. So, and in response, the governor issued an executive order calling for the electrification, the transition to electrification, electric vehicles in light duty, heavy duty, off-road sectors, recognizing a few things. Light duty, we believe there's a path. Is it going to be challenging? It certainly is, and we'll be talking about that in terms of where we are today and how we are moving forward. The executive order calls for 100% sales of ZEVs by 2035, early if we can. And some other requirements, 2035 by drayage trucks, and then off-road and on-road later dates, but that's the full fleet where feasible. And the where feasible was important because there are certain sectors that are going to be extremely challenging. We'll be talking about that a little bit as well. So this slide gets to the scoping plan. So the key elements of the scoping plan get to how do we achieve that stay on track to meet our 2030 target? How do we get to carbon neutrality by 2045? I already talked about electrification, light duty, medium and heavy duty are going to play a key role in this space, as well as VMT and reducing VMT, which is, I know we'll be discussing that further as well, which has been a longstanding challenge in terms of how we're going to get at that, considering our authority, the authorities of others, and the local nature of land use development. The reference to low carbon fuels recognizes a point that I touched on a minute ago, and that is that particularly when we think the heavy duty and off-road space, and even the full transportation sector, includes aviation, it includes marine. Some of these sectors are going to be in liquid fuels for a very long time. That's just a fact. We're looking at every possible place that we can transition out of combustion, but as we're looking at the state of technology and looking at the opportunities, we know those in-use fleets are going to be in operation for some time. So we're also looking at the fleets, or rather the fuels. How do we reduce the carbon intensity of fuel, renewable diesel, sustainable aviation, and also reduce emissions of criteria pollutants, NOx and PM, for that in-use fleet while we're working to turn over fleets to electrify everywhere we possibly can. And what you're seeing in California today is a number of refineries are repurposing. Traditional petroleum-based refineries are repurposing 2 plants today in the Bay Area to produce 100% renewable diesel and or sustainable aviation. Within a year, they'll no longer be refining traditional petroleum. So the diversity of feedstock, the diversity of the fuel supply, and cleaner fuels, frankly, are going to be emerging here, and the many other states and frankly, countries looking. These are international organizations that are making these investments. And I'm going to touch on just a few regulations, some which are under development, underway, others that the board recently adopted. And I should have been clear on this. I mentioned that we're a regulatory agency. So the board is an independent board, mostly of governor appointees and 2 legislative appointees. So we have a board of 16 members, 12 are governor appointees. 2 are legislative appointees, Assembly and Senate, focused on EJ. And then there's 2 legislators, upper and lower house. 1 legislator from the Assembly, 1 legislator from the Senate. And those are my, well, I have a lot of bosses, but those are some of my bosses, would be the board appoints me as the executive officer. I've been executive officer for 9 years, but with the agency about, 37. So what this underscores is a regulation that we're bringing to the board, in fact, next week as a draft. Board won't be voting next week. Advanced clean cars, basically it's light duty vehicles, cars that weigh less than 8,500 gross vehicle weight. It basically is a requirement that does 2 things. So I said that we regulate motor vehicles. This is a regulation on the manufacturers of those vehicles that sell vehicles into the California market. This is about new vehicles, and it's a requirement that a progressively larger share of those vehicles manufacturers produce and sell into the California market are zero-emission vehicles. There's some provisions for strong hybrids. There's some provisions also for tightening the ICE component of the manufacturers, the internal combustion. So as manufacturers produce a larger share of ZEV vehicles, they're still producing internal combustion engines. And what we have found through a number of cases, including the VW case, is certifying engines, certifying vehicles and dynamometers through a range of test cycles is important, but also ongoing field measurements, because you can cheat. And we've put additional provisions in place to make that cheating much, much more difficult. And frankly, it makes it more costly to produce internal combustion engines and expedite the transition to ZEV. So strategically, we are pushing the internal combustion out where there is a clear path to transition to zero-emission vehicles. Other elements of the regulation include consumer assurances in terms of battery performance, OBD, onboard diagnostic related information that vehicles to easily detect performance related issues, charging port related elements, all elements related to consumer transition, ease of use, and consumer acceptance as consumers begin to try non-combustion vehicles, which we're still early in that process. And another element, and you'll see this show up in many, many of the regulations that we are working on, and that is environmental justice. How do we share the technology, share the benefits with low-income communities of color? How do we integrate within the fundamental design of our regulations such that manufacturers bring those vehicles to the communities, operate car share programs, for instance, vehicles that are end of lease stay in the California market and are available through various incentive programs that we're running, as well as some lower price vehicles. So we're working with manufacturers and many others to put these incentive structures in the regulation to really incentivize the outcomes that we're looking for, and are working with, frankly, many from the environmental justice community to help us with this. So that provision, that theme, is reflecting itself in many, many of the regs that we're designing going forward. And this is Clean Miles Standard. This is a reg we adopted. It focused on TNCs, transportation network companies, the largest ones basically that it focused on initially, Lyft and Uber, but basically it was a transition to electric vehicle miles traveled, basically transition to penetrate electric vehicles in that space. It's a great space for consumers to get exposed to what electric vehicles have to offer, and ultimately required a zero-emission footprint. So that reg has also inducements for environmental justice communities, as well as handshakes with transit hubs and so on. Another reg we adopted First, actually, it required 100% transition to zero-emission technology. It was the Innovative Clean Transit Reg, basically public transit fleets. Worked with public transit fleets for years in terms of this regulation. And, basically had a separation between some of the largest transit fleets and the smaller and mid-sized transit fleets. And it related to their purchase and a purchase requirement as they're replacing those buses to transition to electrification. That regulation's playing itself out today, and also is an area that we, the state, has continued to provide incentive dollars to work with the transit fleets as the uptake of zero-emission transit buses continues to play itself out in the state. Advanced Clean Trucks Reg, also recently adopted. And when we think about light duty, heavy duty is far more complex to deal with because the range of technologies, even here, this is a very simplified columns of different classes of trucks as a function of weight. But within those classes are many, many different trucks of different duty cycles and so on. So it was transition everywhere we can to electrify these fleets. They're not on the same timetable. We also knew that Advanced Clean Trucks Reg is just one element. Incentives are another part, and another reg, a fleet reg I'll touch on, is also part of it. So there's not one reg that is going to get us there in total. It's a package of requirements, incentives, and working with manufacturers and others. So this reg's relatively early, but a number of sectors, I'll touch on this, are producing dozens of different models of zero-emission trucks already today, commercial product. This gets to a reg that we are currently working on. We'll bring to our board later this year. It's a market pull reg, basically requirement on fleets. As generally, as they are replacing vehicles, there's a fleet component requirement, progressively greater share of their fleets, of these mid and larger fleets, will be composed of zero-emission trucks of varying types. So this is a reg that we are still going through the regulatory process. We're looking at different incentives and so on, and there'll certainly be pushback as there is on all our regs. But this handshakes with that Advanced Clean Truck Reg I touched on, as well as the billion plus incentive dollars. And this gets to the incentives. So the state, between last year and this year, and these are just California incentives. I'm not touching on local and I'm not touching on federal. Between last year and the proposal this year is a $10 billion package to support the transition to zero-emission vehicles, buses, school buses, drayage trucks, transit buses, cars, used cars, and trucks. So it's a broad package, substantial appropriation to CARB, our agency, to administer these dollars, as well as the Energy Commission and others on the infrastructure side. There's substantial infrastructure investments too, because it's equally important as the vehicles as we're moving forward. And they'll be administering these dollars for the next few years. And the transition, which many of you are familiar with, to EVs, and this is light duty, but I could say the same about trucks. If I look at just the last quarter of 2022, most recent quarter, the uptake, sales of new zero-emission vehicles, primarily BEVs, 16%. And if I think about, well, how things played out from 2012, there are 4 or 5, so 10 years ago, 4 or 5 zero-emission vehicle models available. Today, there's over 70. And the manufacturers, the OEMs, within the next 2 to 3 years, we expect that number to triple. Over 200 models of zero-emission vehicles, many of which are in the low end affordability, high end of the range, 300, 400, 500-mile range. The innovation that's playing itself out in the market, how rapidly it's transitioning. For someone that's been in this space for a long time, CARB's first zero-emission reg was in 1990, has changed in a very, very short period of time. And part of it has been, we've noticed years of opposition from manufacturers. We're not having that now. What we're seeing is manufacturers not only making public pronouncements, but having dollars behind those pronouncements, billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of investments in their future, realizing that is where the future is going to be. Cost of ownership rapidly going down, and that was before current fuel prices. And this just gets at the range, just a taste of the range of zero-emission trucks, of the different classes, which are a function of weight and duty cycle and specialty. Dozens of large manufacturers as well as upstarts that are producing zero-emission trucks, all the way from delivery vans to the highest, to the heaviest 80,000-pound Class 8 trucks that we see. And VMT. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more over the course of the days, I think. And, you know, if we look at VMT, vehicle miles traveled, it has continued to increase. And there's a blip in terms of the pandemic, the early part of the pandemic, but we're back on track to see it's increasing. We see what fuel consumption is in diesel. We see gasoline fuel consumption. And even for those that have taken the position, well, as you electrify, is VMT important anymore? Well, it is. Because one, we're going to be in combustion for a long time. Two, we care about brake emissions, tire emissions, whole range of issues, and it ultimately becomes a proxy for mobility and access. So we have a lot of work to do with local entities, land use development, and others to really get in front of the VMT issue. We're working with Caltrans, CalSTA, and a whole range of other agencies in terms of what do the incentives look like? What are we incentivizing? What are we measuring? And up until fairly recently, VMT really wasn't a substantive metric. It is now in that conversation. Every conversation I'm in with other agencies, including the planning agencies, is about what are the impacts of a proposed project on VMT. So we have not gotten in front of this. I know we'll talk further about it, but there is hope for actually making some real progress. And it'll be more than just emissions that it's about. It's really becomes a proxy for mobility and access and a whole range of other related issues from an equity standpoint we should probably talk about. All right. This gets at embedded the points I just made about VMT in terms of its proxy. And also, I think about it, I think GHG, I think criteria pollutant, I think about access. I also think most people don't want to spend time in their vehicles. They have to because they want affordable living, and affordable living in many cases for many folks means having to move far away from where they work. And there's opportunity. We can do better here, and obviously planners and many others have a lot of brain power to bring to this challenge, and the signals, policy signals and economic signals that are sent to developers and land use decision-making process. So more on this, I'm sure. This underscores my point in terms of if you look at housing, where's the housing taking place? And if I even look at my own nearby community, when even I look at infill developments, they've been pretty high-end, high value, not lower income access type of projects. Again, an area that I think is becoming talked about often now, understood, and it's an area where I think we can collectively do better. And it's one we're going to have to get in front of this issue. I think the need for housing in California over the next planning cycle, the next several years, 5 to 8 years, 2.5 million homes additional are needed. About 1 million of those need to be low-income home housing, and that's not the track we're on today. And VMT. I'm not going to go through each of these because I think we'll be talking a little further, but it just gets at, maybe I'll call out the fourth bullet here, the Climate Action Plan, the CAPDI report, which was really a CalSTA report to better inform California Caltrans investments in infrastructure projects and the metrics by which we were looking at those investments. What are the impacts on GHG? What are the impacts on VMT? And I'm not saying those conversations never happen, but I would argue that they are happening at a level that they never have before with the support of the governor and the administration on how are these decisions and how is this funding? Does it advance the overall, does it align with climate and clean air policy? or is it not? And how do we better align if that's not the case? A lot of work with California Transportation Commission, as well as Housing and Community Development and many others in this space to work through and develop strategies, and clearly the role that the locals play in this space as well. These are a number of strategies on VMT that I'm going to move through pretty quickly because I think I'm getting short on time. But one thing that has been clear to us is the support for transit. I mean, if anyone's seen what happened to public transit during the pandemic, well, people didn't want to be near one another, understandably. Transit was already struggling. We really are convinced we need to do a much better job of supporting public transportation. Getting everyone in an EV is not the solution to our issues. It's not a single occupancy vehicle. And most people don't actually want that. They actually do want to get to point A to point B and do it efficiently and quickly. In many of the cases I've talked about, they don't have that option. The option is a vehicle. That's it. That's what they got. We can do a far better job in terms of what are those tools to get to outlying areas. It may not be a bus. How does that handshake with the bus? What's the role of the transit agency? I think the experience and history of transit agencies coming out of this pandemic, and also as we look at the VMT challenge, there's an opportunity here in terms of public transportation in many areas of the state that has really not been, we haven't really cracked that not well. Okay. More VMT, including the role of autonomous vehicles. I actually saw a talk over there I'm going to go to later today. It looks like it'll be interesting. But we have an opportunity in terms of the signals we send and the alignment of policy with air quality, climate, housing. It's transportation. I'm convinced of this. It's like you all working in the transportation space is super exciting. Is like the last frontier. It is the opportunity and the convergence of air quality, climate, housing, and equity. The challenge is, how do you get those points to converge on effective policies, many of which, honestly, I characterize as experimentation. Like there's a number of experiments that are playing itself. I don't think that's a bad word. I think we tried a lot of things. Some haven't worked. You set it down, you move on. I think that's what it's going to take. I think it's going to take a lot of smart people working together, understanding the problem, tracking progress, honestly reporting on that progress, and partnering with others. And when I say that, it's the academic community, it's the MPOs, it's communities, it's the environmental justice community, it's other states and jurisdictions. And I think I'm going to end on that point, because if I think about the role that our agency has played, and we get, maybe even some would say more than we should, but a lot of credit for the progress that California has made from an air quality standpoint. Even though I recognize, you should all recognize, we haven't attained our health-based standard, but the progress we have made is undeniable. And it's one of the reasons why other states come to California, other jurisdictions that are facing similar problems in terms of what was the process? How did we move forward? How did we effectively deliver on some of the programs and regulations that we delivered on? I'm convinced that partnerships are fundamental to our effectiveness as an organization and a state. And even when we adopt a regulation, first thing we do when we're working through it, we're reaching out to other states. Because when I talked about the Clean Air Act, other states have the ability to adopt California's regulation. They can't adopt their own, but they can adopt California's. So traditionally, and we did this also with the ACC reg I mentioned, we normally right out the gate have 15 states that are partners. So we already have 40% of the vehicle population in the United States. We use that leverage with automobile manufacturers, so California is not isolated. We use that leverage with international jurisdictions. Those partnerships send signals to the market that expedite the transition and investment of capital on the part of those companies, that this isn't a California thing. It's much, much broader. So those partnerships are fundamental to our effectiveness. So I could go on a lot more, but you guys aren't going to want me to. So I'm going to wrap up. So there you go.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Richard. I'm sure it looks like you're keeping all 1,700 CARB employees very busy.
1750.
1,750. So we're running a little bit over, but I think we want to make sure we give Richard a chance to answer a couple brief questions. So just heads up to our next panel. Thanks for being accommodating. So that was terrific, and I'm sure that if asked, you could go twice as long with twice as many programs to share. So thank you. Just a couple questions that we had, and we'd also welcome. I think we probably have time for a question from the audience too, if anybody wants. There's mics on either side. But the first question, was around VMT, and I think that's really exciting and new and challenging and all kinds of different verbs. But when we talk about electrification, you're largely replacing similar utility, right? It's a new technology, but people don't necessarily need to change dramatically how they run their business or travel to take kids to soccer or to mom to the grocery or the hospital. But when we're talking about vehicle mileage travel, that's often seen as taking something away, right? Or telling people that they can't travel the way they want to or the way that they feel like it's sort of they're entitled to, despite what I'm sure is important messaging. So I guess I'm just curious about a couple of questions related to the vehicle mileage travel efforts. First of all, what, if anything, is making you optimistic about progress in that area? And maybe building on that, are there messages that you've seen resonate with people? I think you brought up one that was around people don't want to spend more time in their car, right? They don't want to spend more money on transportation, and owning a vehicle is expensive. But are there other ways that you've seen sort of, get people on board and that might contribute to any optimism you have?
No, great questions. And to the first part, and thinking, I was reflecting on, and I stopped, when you said I've been at the agency 30 years, I probably shouldn't even say it's longer. It's like, it just means I'm old. But having been at the agency as long as I've been, so 37 years, I've been talking about EVs forever, right? I said the first regulation was 1990, it was. Didn't lead to, there's a whole history behind that longer than we can go into here. But the environment is radically different. But to your point on VMT, with the California Transportation Commission, with Housing Community Development, for years, we really couldn't talk about VMT in a serious conversation in a public forum. Just couldn't. Basically, no, that's not your space, CARB space. Either you're a quality agency, you set standards for vehicles, fuels, planning-related investments, that stay out of our backyard. The merging, and I'm going to say from the leadership of the administrations, Brown was clearly on this, Newsom is, and some of the appointments of the administrations. And at the end of the day, it's leadership that sends clear signals. I'm convinced of it. And it is guidelines and expectations, and ultimately it is how dollars are spent. Existing dollars that are programmed into a system, as well as future dollars, that's changing. And they're valuing, or at least considering, the implications of GHG and VMT. I'm seeing that change, and I'm seeing it firsthand. Is it fast enough? Probably not. But it's real, and it's genuine, and we're looking at those model projects. To me, that is real change. And most of that I've described has occurred just in the last few years. In terms of, some would say, well, maybe that's not as optimistic as that's a realistic view, and it's agencies. Moving large agencies that fund, billions of dollars, that's challenging, and it's a slow process. But I'm seeing clear indications of that change that's playing itself out here. And in terms of the optimism in terms of VMT, a few things, and you touched on this, I think it's key, is that to me, the VMT is a proxy for the lack of alternatives in many, many cases. We've gone up and down the state meeting with communities on a program called 617. It was a community-based program that are working with communities exposed to toxic pollutants. Many of them, are low-income communities of color. their job isn't near where they live. They want to get, like everyone else, affordable housing. Affordable housing had them move out. And not only move out, you go to these communities, most of these communities, they don't have sidewalks. It's not safe to ride a bike. They don't have grocery stores. They have to drive their food islands. They're isolated. They're completely cut off from any other means to get from point A to point B besides a vehicle. They don't want that, and they will tell you that. They want a connectedness, and not to wait on a transit bus 5 times longer than it would take if they had their own vehicle. That's where I have hope, because it's not requiring a rocket launch. It's requiring existing technology, existing incentives and opportunities to me that I think there's a path. Now, is it hard? Of course it's going to be hard. The local incentive structure incentivizes development the way I just described it today, but that is a solvable problem.
That's great. And I think, the fact that you're starting to make the connections, or I'm sure not starting, but you shared the slide about making the connections with housing and land use. And I mean, I think it highlights the complexity of all that, but also the value, as you mentioned, with this framing around accessibility, really, and providing those options. So that's great. Thanks, Giovanni.
You mentioned changing behaviors of individuals, so the VMT is very difficult. And the other part of the question is also making people adopt new technologies. So you clearly have talked about this big effort for electrification in California in a multimodal transportation framework. So thinking about private vehicles, but also the TNCs, the buses, the trucks. What do you think, what gives you most optimism that the process, the path to electrification is going well? And where do you think the biggest challenges are?
To me, what I'm saying in terms, and I touched on this on light duty, I could also do the same on heavy duty. The point that I made about on light duty, 70 models today. We're gonna have over 200 models of light duty electric vehicles. And in many platforms that just a few years ago, people said you would not see battery electrics because the platforms were too heavy. The vision at the time, just a few years ago, was battery electrics are for the lightest small vehicles. That's where the utility is, that's where you're gonna get the range, and it's really are not viable. At the same time, energy density is radically improved on the batteries. You've got the battery, a lot more utility on the vehicles. I mean, you've got the greatest, highest selling truck in America is the F-150. You got Ford behind this. And so the change that I saw was the decision by companies to direct capital in their future. So what's happening, what would happen in the old days was, so I'm really simplifying this, but you got a company, automobile manufacturer, that has an internal combustion engine line, an EV line. 99% of the dollars are this is a research, it's a toy project. Now, they're progressively putting far more resources, far more capital into the future in terms of the electrification of the vehicle, in models, in batteries. And the challenge we're having with the automobile manufacturers completely changed. It shifted to, we don't want you to have a tighter ICE standard because we're having to redirect capital from our BEV line. Now we're saying, well, wait a minute, that's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is maybe we're supporting the transition, expediting the transition to the battery electric lines. And these are every major company. So you've got hundreds of billions of dollars behind this transition. So it's regulations, it's capital following that market signal, it's sticking to that market signal, that policy signal. And I'm seeing the same thing on the truck side. And with respect to the challenge, this is always the issue, because people will talk about, hey, how about electrification won't work today for a cross-country Class 8 truck that's driving to Chicago. My point is, well, there's some counters to that, but in terms of viable today, I wouldn't even challenge that. I don't need to challenge that. But basically, I would look at the heavy-duty space is not monolithic. It is heterogeneous. There's multiple applications today that are fully commercialized. the lighter delivery trucks, the Class 8 vehicles, the drayage trucks, part of its utility cycle. What are they doing? What are the range that they're operating these things under? And I'm just seeing that improvement occur every day in terms of the vehicle quality, the range, and the number of models. Infrastructure is going to be one we have to continue to work on. I mean, we certainly know what it's going to take. The challenge is today is the charging station has an upstream transformer, and how much electricity can I get to that location? For instance, how much electricity do I need to deliver at a port if I fully electrify all trucks? Can my system actually support that? That kind of analysis is site specific. It's playing itself out now. If I'm going to electrify locomotives at a rail yard, how much megawatt hours do I need to push through that system at that time during a certain time frame? That's the work that's going on right now. So it's location specific. That's the work that's taking place with utilities today. It's taking place with the PUC and the CEC, and there's funding behind it.
A lot of great reasons for being optimistic, but also
so.
Big challenges also to work on.
For sure.
And very important, yeah. I know we're running late, but we probably have time for one or two quick questions for Richard from the audience.
Go to the mic.
If you want to use the microphone over there.
The question is, unfortunately at the federal level, we have funding formulas that allocate 80% to highway and 20% to transit. So it seems to me we need to change those formulas. We're really going to address sustainability and equity.
Well, I think you're probably right, so I'm going to speak to what California can do. And one thing that we've talked to locals about, is public transit should be free. In terms of how do you send the right signal, and if you valued, one exercise here, just a thought exercise, but if I've looked at the public health benefits of reduced NOx, PM, so it's driven by NOx and PM. So what we do with any regulation, and I could certainly do it on the benefits of added transit, monetize what those reduced emissions translate into in terms of reduced premature mortality, asthma cases, lost work days, and lost school days. We're trying to do a lot better job about characterizing the hidden consequences of dependency on traditional combustion and use that as a support, economic support for expediting the transition. I think that plays into the support for transit as well, in terms of the public health role, the public service they play, also the public health role they play as well. And it's certainly the administration, Newsom administration, did provide incentive dollars last year and this year. And again, it's never enough, so you're never gonna hear me characterize as though, hey, there's enough money. So even that $10 billion number looks big on its face, but when you start to break it down, the number of vehicles, what we have, 15,000 transit buses in the state. I think we have 24,000 school buses. Just school buses alone, if you electrified every school bus, that's $10 billion. You can kind of get a sense of need more funding, but the dollars supported in the budget, 1,000 electric transit buses. It was a start. It'll help us get there on the bus side, but I think there's, on the ops side, more that can be done as well.
So we have somebody waiting for a question. I just want to preface this. I apologize. We're running a little over and want to respect the other panel. If we can keep it kind of quick on both sides, I apologize, but that would be excellent. But we want to give you a chance.
That may have been more to me.
No.
How we deal with existing modes of transportation. And the major problem I see is that we have 4,000 pounds. How to make a rail was 2,000 pounds. If you think but in 2020, there's a huge potential for taking a very automated vehicle, micro vehicle, keep the culture release,
I didn't hear it enough. Can you?
I think the main question is about right sizing of the vehicle, right? Like with the automation, with the new technologies, about like the right size of the vehicle so they can be much more efficient and lead to.
The silo, thinking about existing modes of transportation, I think it would really make a breakthrough that would be useful to think of. There's a lot of work to do. Real functionality, use the vehicle.
Yeah, I didn't.
I tell you what, if we can follow up with that. I appreciate the question. I think we just need to. It sounds like a question that deserves a little bit more of a response to. So why don't we I want to thank our keynote, Richard.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here.
And Richard will stay with us anyway because we're going to stay on the podium now for the panel.
Oh,
Yeah.
So if there are more questions for
I'm gonna
Richard,
stay
you
there.
can.
okay.
Awesome. So much.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Okay.
And so we'll lead into the panel with apologies for the panelists for the delay.
Hey, how you?
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I think it's clear based on Richard's speech why we're in California to discuss these really important issues because they've been such a leader, at least across the U.S., in terms of the policies and the technologies that they're working on to try to get us to a sustainable future. So I've got three other really excellent panelists up here to talk about what are some trends that we're seeing, and again, especially because we've been planning this conference so long, whether they were pre-COVID or post-COVID, in terms of either what your agencies are seeing or what you as an academic are seeing in your research that your agency is doing to think about how we're going to move forward in terms of using technology to support policies that we have in place or to support outcomes-based and measurable outcomes like reducing VMT, and also how can technology play a role in terms of helping us advance sustainability, whether we're talking about improved environment, improved equity, reduced disparities, or improving the economy. So let me start. We've been able to get a really good introduction from Richard. I would like to hear from our other three panelists, but my name is Renee Autumn-Ray. I am a Senior Director of Global Industry Strategy at Hayden AI. We're a startup based in Oakland, California. And so I'm here representing the two TRB committees I sit on, Intelligent Transportation Systems and the Emerging and Innovative Public Transit. So excited to be here this afternoon. And first would ask Bill, Alante, and Sean to give an introduction of their roles and why they're here today.
Thanks, Renee. It's great to be here in person and see a bunch of folks. My name is Bill Bacon. I am with the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, which is the transportation planning and finance agency for the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm a principal there, and I oversee our transit operations funding programs and our transit operations policy initiatives. So a lot of our work over the last couple of years has been focused on sustaining our transit operations through a really challenging period for public transit agencies, as well as really trying to bring the system back with a more customer-oriented, customer-focused recovery. So thanks again.
Hello, my name is Alante Whitmore. I'm the new director of the Autonomous Vehicle Initiative at SAFE. I've been there just a couple of months. I'm previously completed my joint PhD in civil engineering and engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon, where I explored the economic, equity, and ethical impacts of autonomous vehicles, specifically when integrating them with integrating them into public transit. And so I'll be sharing a bit of my dissertation research and experience or understanding and knowledge in the autonomous shared space and how it can help capture some of the goals that we've already started to discuss, as well as what I'm going to be doing in my new role at SAFE.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sean Miller. I'm a senior planner at LA Metro's Office of Innovation. We sort of have two focuses on the partnerships team, which is where I sit. We have an unsolicited proposals policy, which generates a lot of ideas from the private sector for innovative projects that lead to pilot projects at Metro. And then we also do early feasibility and financial analysis of delivery methods for major capital transit and projects and transit corridors. So for instance, like the West Santa Ana branch, Sepulveda Transit Corridor, as well as our zero emission bus program.
Great. So before I kick off the first question, let me say you've got two mics up here. So if there's a point at which you want to ask a question, please come to one of the mics. And when we've wrapped up, I'll call on you to ask that question. Let me start first by saying I love the focus on VMT reduction, Richard, that you had in your keynote. I'm wondering if any of the other speakers can talk about whether that is a goal that your agency or your employer has, or if there are other ways that you're using something that's easily quantifiable to measure your progress against and to build programs around.
Looking at me. Okay. Well, I mean, that's a great question, and it's certainly something that is being thought about. And actually, while I was thinking about VMT, there's a project that I led for a brief time, our Mobility on Demand rideshare pilot, which was a first last mile rideshare program that was operating during the pandemic. So originally, first last mile during the pandemic actually transitioned to point-to-point service to provide better transportation options, especially at a time when folks were, really needed transportation options to get to the places they needed to go. Through that, it was an FTA-funded pilot. We had an independent evaluation by, I think there were some folks maybe in this room that were involved in that. And actually, one of the key findings from that project is, in fact, that throughout that pilot, during the first year of the pilot, which was January 2019 to January 2020, we found that or at least the independent evaluator found that most of the hypotheses of this project were supported, that people had improved access to the destinations that they needed to be to, that they had improved access to TNC. But one of the hypotheses that was not supported was that VMT did not go down. And so we saw an increase in VMT because there were a lot of vehicle hours without riders, and we also thereby saw an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So, certainly something I think just through that project that, we've been thinking about, and as well as Metro has been embarking on its traffic reduction study over the past couple of years. It's definitely in folks' mind in terms of it, being a clear goal or something that's found within a policy or planning document. Not quite sure to the extent that it's found its way into there yet, but it's definitely an important topic of discussion at the agency.
I can chime in there too. The MTC and our partner agency, the Association of Bay Area Governments, are responsible for producing a regional transportation plan. And in California, there's an added component called the Sustainable Community Strategy. And that really is trying to bring together housing and transportation planning, and has really changed the game in California in terms of how public agencies that manage these two issues work together. And in our region, in the Bay Area, over the last decade, we've really experienced an unprecedented era of economic expansion. And with that has come probably the most severe housing affordability crisis in the United States. And sort of the direct consequence of that has been massive displacement of lower and middle income communities in our region. People, just as Richard was saying, are having to drive farther and farther in order to access jobs, in order to access opportunity. And a lot of the people who have been displaced are not people who can work on Zoom, who can't change their work patterns because of the environment that we now find ourselves in. They still need to be at a work location 5 days a week or more in order to earn their paycheck. So the consequences of that increased VMT that we've seen in our region has been slower transit travel times for a lot of users who don't have access to cars, In the heart of Silicon Valley, the largest transit agency is called VTA. And over the last 20 years, they've actually seen the average bus speed of their vehicles decrease by 25%. And that has huge impacts both on customer usability in terms of how long it takes you to travel, but it also is a big impact on the agency's bottom line. Now, if they want to run the same headways, if you want 15-minute headways, you have to run more buses. You need to have more operators who also need a place to live in a very expensive region. So these crises really build on each other and become harder and harder to solve. So it's sort of a roundabout answer, but VMT is a really important measure for us as well.
I wasn't sure if you had a question or were, no.
I do.
Great.
But you're having a nice conversation. I was writing some notes.
Yeah, no.
Anyway, my name's Deborah Salon. I'm at Arizona State University. And my question is related to the first speaker, but also for everyone. I'm really curious. Something I think about a lot is when I hear discussions like I've heard so far today, where people are talking about really, great investments in alternatives to driving and different experiments going on and all this stuff. And then they talk about VMT reduction, but they don't talk sometimes, and like today, I feel like I haven't really heard a whole lot of focused disincentives for driving. Because I think that driving beats transit in most ways for most trips, for most people, in terms of convenience, sometimes even for price. And certainly if you're traveling, carrying a bunch of stuff or with a bunch of people. And I think, and it's also at the habit that everybody's in. So I feel like we really need to put in some strong disincentives for driving if these investments in these alternatives are going to become popular. So I'd love to hear you guys kind of comment on that. Thanks.
Richard?
Yeah, I'll start. I'm actually glad you asked that because I did have, amongst many of those bullets, there was a user fee road charge element. We're convinced that that is an element that really has not been, for obviously some real political and local challenges, exhausted, and one that we're talking with locals about, one that we're talking with other agencies about. I think one of the challenges, and this is a solvable problem as well, it's the potentially regressive nature, right? So we just talked about who's driving very long distances. We talked about fuel prices. So you've got to have an element in a fundamental design that sends the right policy signal that you're just talking about that supports alternatives, substitutes, but also recognizes that it's not disproportionately those that are spending the largest share of their income on transportation costs aren't hurt even more. How do you do this? And again, it is doable from a design standpoint. It actually may require legislation to actually pull this off, but is one that we are actively talking about because we're convinced at the end of the day, what is significantly going to turn VMT. We're convinced user fees are going to have to be part of that response.
Glad to hear that.
I'll just briefly add that MTC is just launching what we're calling our Next Generation Freeway Initiative, which is a sort of fancy way of saying a all-lane tolling study across the entire Bay Area freeway network, which again would obviously require significant legislative change at both the state and federal level if it were to be implemented. But this process is just getting underway really in the last couple months, and it's really focused starting with communities on the ground, especially with low and middle income people in the Bay Area. And that's really sort of the foundation for the study to understand how you could implement something like all lane tolling on the freeway system in a more equitable way.
Hello, my name is Mauricio. I work for Metropolitan Council, which is the metropolitan planning organization of the Twin Cities in Minnesota. My question is on BMT and this high-speed rail project that is happening in California, very controversial. I think it's a very important strategy to reduce vehicle miles traveled, but I want to ask you, as Californians, what is your perspective on the future of high-speed rail?
Well, that'll be easy. It's continuing, and it's continuing because not only do the Brown administration support it, the Newsom administration supports it, and labor supports it. So there's a number of projects that are major construction projects that are being built now. A good share, and this is actually not only are there some federal matching dollars, a good share of the funding for the high-speed rail program, and people actually don't realize this, it actually comes from the administration, our administration of the cap and trade regulation. So we have a state cap and trade regulation that fuels and industrial sources are under as part of our GHG reduction program, a reducing cap, but some flexibilities in terms of how instruments are acquired to offset one's emissions. Part of that includes an auction. Part of that auction generates state revenue. Traditionally, like that, we have been generating about $5 billion a year. 25%, I think it's 25% of that goes directly to high-speed rail. And this is over, obviously, a multi-decade related program. So that program is going to move forward without question in terms of the funding behind it. The question will be, does it expand? Ultimately, what outlying areas does it meet, and so on. It will not, and I know you didn't imply this, single-handedly meet the range of transportation and transit response needs that we have across the state. It's one element, right, that is covering some major routes that will continue to be constructed over the next 10, 15, 20 years. So it's a very long-term project that is an element of an overall response.
So while we're on the topic of funding, I'd like to ask whether it's for the California agencies, through Governor Newsom's budget, or from the recently passed IIJA funding from the federal level, what are some technologies that are top of mind that you think might be eligible through some of this funding that you feel are going to be impactful for your agency? If you've even had time to think through,
No,
you know.
I mean, well, one of the initiatives what we have at Metro is, bipartisan infrastructure law, strategic planning team, where we're trying to determine how is Metro going to go after these funding opportunities over the next 5 years. And so, a really important focus of that includes project readiness. What is the state of projects? It's pretty easy to kind of identify those projects in year one, but what does the strategy look like in the out years, year 2, 3, 4, and 5, so that you can be competitive? Certainly one of the top priorities, I think, for Metro is to transition to its bus fleet to zero-emission vehicles. Our goal is currently to have a 100% zero-emission fleet by 2030. We're in the midst of that process right now, but still in the early stages. We've only electrified one of our BRT lines, but we have 2,200 buses that we have to figure out how we do that by 2030. So the infrastructure law is going to be critical to that. But I think that there's also other opportunities through the infrastructure law that can, there are billions of dollars. Another grant that's certainly on my radar, at least, and presents a unique opportunity for kind of harnessing, whether it be autonomous vehicles, connected roadways, connected infrastructure, is the upcoming SMART grant, which looks really interesting, but no idea. I don't think we're anywhere near wrapping our heads around that yet, but I think that will come out later this year. But yeah, definitely in terms of electrifying the fleet, the infrastructure law is going to be critical to us achieving that very aggressive goal.
I'll just add one other piece around zero-emission buses in particular. So, there's a lot of talk about actual vehicles and having those zero-emission vehicles, whether they be battery or fuel cell operated or any other technologies. One of the things that we're focusing on in the Bay Area is in partnership with the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, which is our regional air quality regulatory agency, sort of under CARB. is working together with them on the actual charging or fueling infrastructure that's needed to transition our fleet. So in some ways, it might be easier to sign a contract with a manufacturer to procure the vehicles, but what's the actual infrastructure that's needed on the ground to actually service those vehicles? And in the Bay Area for a long time now, we've had a pretty significant sized fleet of fuel cell hybrid vehicles that one of our large operators, AC Transit in the East Bay, has used. So taking lessons learned from AC Transit with their fuel cell fleet, expanding that to other operators that want to have fuel cell infrastructure. And then on the EV side, speaking, with our utilities, primarily Pacific Gas and Electric, about what types of changes need to be made to the infrastructure to really have reliable charging. And that's a big concern in California because some of you may have seen over the years, we've had a series of either blackouts due to power outages or I should say demand, excess demand, as well as public safety power shutoffs to reduce fire risk. And especially in sort of outer parts of our region, it's been a real concern that if we transition to an EV bus fleet, that what will we be able to do to charge the buses when there is a power outage, and how will we be able to provide reliable service? And in a number of instances in the last decade in our region, public transit buses have been used actually as an evacuation vehicle for people fleeing wildfires. So that's also been a big concern, is how do you have reliability with the zero emission bus fleet? So that's something we're focusing a lot on.
One thing that both Sean and Bill have touched on is an agency trying something new and disseminating or sharing that information so that other practitioners can sort of learn, whether it's the MOD project that LA Metro did as part of an FTA grant, or AC Transit sort of leading the way in a fleet electrification, or I think you said hydrogen, and being able to disseminate that with other agencies. So Alante, I'm actually wondering if you can talk a little bit about your research into autonomous vehicles and how you're disseminating and sharing that to help practitioners sort of learn what might be coming, how do agencies or other private sector companies need to prepare for it, how close are we actually getting?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, events like this, having opportunity to talk to folks and share some of the things that I have learned through my work, and then engaging with cities and transit agencies about the opportunities that are available. I know that maybe it's not applicable for IIJA, but thinking about next steps as far as piloting autonomous vehicles, how they can be integrated into into the existing system. And specifically, I think something I like to harp on, I think is important, is to realize that every system has different needs as it relates to the future of technology, transportation technology, specifically if we're thinking about autonomous vehicles or shuttles or first last mile service versus a full system having autonomous vehicles. So kind of understanding the needs of the city itself or the transit agency, and kind of making sure that they can organize themselves in a way that is going to not only increase equity and reduce VMT, but also provide a better service and expand transit coverage. I think there are a lot of opportunities, but each city can think uniquely about their needs to address that. So coming to places like this and discussing those points and being engaged in a lot of conversations, especially in the autonomous vehicle track, please come. I think we can have some good convo.
I like the point you made about people recognizing that, you can't have one solution that's going to work for every system or every agency. I feel like particularly in the transit realm, the dramatic changes we've seen in terms of how many people were still riding commuter rail and how many people were still riding the bus, right, when we were in quarantine. And I feel like that's raised the awareness. I think a lot of folks within those agencies probably understood the differences in terms of like ridership and travel behavior and what people wanted before COVID, but I think it's just come into more stark relief as a result of the ways that we've had to adapt during this pandemic. I'm wondering if there are any examples that you've seen in your work in terms of, we looked at a best practice that a particular agency or company was doing, and here's how we adapted it to fit the unique needs that we had. Maybe it was our region of the country, it was the size of the population that we work within, or in some other way. Is that something anybody can speak to? That's a curveball I just threw out at y'all. Nobody was prepared.
I mean, I guess I'll just share. This is more information sharing. I mean, one of our largest transit operator in the Bay Area, the SFMTA, which serves just the city of San Francisco, like their peers around the country, really had to redesign their service because of the pandemic. And they took a very data-driven approach to how they would redesign their service. They had limited number of operators available to operate their routes. So they basically analyzed sort of the demographics of the city and said, we want, X% of the most sort of vulnerable populations to be within a certain number of minutes. I think it was a 5-minute walk of a service that was still operating at, I think, a 10-minute headway. And they really use these sort of standards around equity and focusing service in the places that most needed it, and really focus, again, on accessibility to that service throughout the pandemic. So I'm not sure if that really answers your question, but,
No, that's a great answer. Yeah.
I would throw a curveball back at you too, but
Go for it.
I think there's a lot of ways to kind of attack that question, which I think not in like a mean way, but like to respond to that question, whether you're thinking about a specific project or, the transit system as a whole, I think, something that our office does at LA Metro is to figure out ways to partner with lots of different folks. So, I mean, what Alante is saying about knowledge sharing is so critical to what we do, understanding what other agencies are doing, but also understanding some of the opportunities that are available in the marketplace to integrate with Metro's system. The Mod one is an example where we're partnering with a private company to provide this service, but not to take riders away from the public transit system, but to integrate with it, to improve connections to the public transit system, especially maybe at areas where it's not easy for folks to get to, right? So, we take that approach, pretty seriously, that we realize Metro is not able to solve these big problems on its own, and we really need partners from other agencies, from other, whether they be transportation agencies or other regulatory bodies, whether they be the private sector, and also our community members as well. I mean, our community members within LA County are absolutely critical in understanding, what their needs are and how they, in fact, inform these projects as well. So I think it's just critical that we bring as many folks to the table as possible to think about these problems so that we can adapt, and not just in times like the pandemic where we have to adapt very quickly, but in terms of thinking about what is the transportation system going to look like in 2030 and 2050 and beyond that.
Are there any ways that you're changing how you do your work, either as a result of having a new piece of technology available that helps you do your job better, or something that you've learned as a result of COVID about a previous way of doing business that just doesn't really fit anymore? Any sort of internal processes that you might be changing, or something that you started temporarily during COVID that you think, this worked really well, and I think this is how we're going to operate from here on out?
I mean, I can take a stab, but it's probably the same issues that everyone in here and your organizations are working through, but just to use our organization as the example. So I mentioned 1,750 people. They don't all have the same job. Some are very office-oriented. Some are field enforcement-related personnel. Some are some are in our Riverside facility that are running dynamometers. They're running shed tests. They're running evap tests on different engines, engine dynos, full vehicle dynos, informing standards, and ultimately supporting our enforcement efforts. So I have a number of folks that are lab-oriented, actually need them in the lab, maybe not 5 days a week, but a good share of the week to be able to do the job. Other folks, like I indicated, are very field-oriented. I need them in the field. I mean, we can't, some of our enforcement work is office-oriented, but some is field. And I've got office-oriented folks. So when we looked at this holistically, it was from an internally facing organization standpoint is, the first principle is the work's got to get done, right? And if we can find ways to be more effective, more efficient as an organization, what could we learn from our effectively our pandemic and our substantial telework policy that we had instituted? Prior to the pandemic, we really didn't allow much telework. We didn't actually allow it for managers. We wanted them in the office. That I've changed, and we've changed as an organization. But we haven't got to the point where, as an organization, for those that can work telework, it's 100%. We've kind of concluded that we are more effective as an organization and culturally more effective in an investment in our own people when we interact with people. Zoom's great, Teams great, we're using it. We're reducing VMT. But it's not a straight substitute for the nature of our work and what we do. We're looking for a balance. And for those office-oriented people, we're looking for a balance where they can work at home several days a week. But I do need them in but when they come in, it's not to come in and work independently at a cubicle and not interact with anyone. It takes actually more planning to actually work with your team, use that time, work with external stakeholders. That's the process that we're going through right now. And actually, I have characterized 2022 as a pilot for the organization to take some of those learnings from the pandemic and apply them internally. And also, I would say externally. Traditionally, our board meetings, they were webcast, but they were basically, for the webcast participants, they watched. They didn't actually have a means by which to engage board members, ask questions, testify. We will never go back to that. We will have a hybrid. You want to come to a board meeting in person, you can, and you can testify. You want to participate via Zoom, you can. Now, from a management standpoint, it creates some challenges logistically, but that's on us, and we're working through that right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think particularly because, everyone is struggling to retain high-performing staff, but I think the public agencies, it's no exception, whether we're talking about operators or planning or administrative staff, and being able to have some level of flexibility for staff who can telework and take advantage of technology that allows you to do that is important. But yeah, you have to be intentional so that it's not 6 people come to the office and get on Zoom together and have a meeting with 3 people that aren't in the office. Anyone else or
contribute a little bit more meta?
I think
go
meta.
During the pandemic, right? We also collectively experienced a lot of civil unrest and the concerns and thoughts about equity and what that means. And even though I genuinely do feel like in transportation, equity has been a part of the conversation. EJ work has existed prior to 2020, but I think now it's just much more intentional and integrated into how we're thinking. And I think that's a positive thing that it seems there's an energy towards collectively continuing that behavior moving forward. And I just think that's a positive thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Ma'am,
yeah,
please ask your question.
Sorry, I'm a little far away.
No.
Hi, I'm Ev. I'm a technical consultant and sustainability analyst for Trimble, an industrial technology company. I just wanted to ask, as we talk about the electrification of fleets and the new infrastructure coming in, how we see that comparing to maybe the creation and production emissions, how we see the sources of the electricity for charging, and potentially the wasted infrastructure and vehicles as they kind of transition out, and how that compares to the benefits of electrification?
I'll start and others can add in. So an element that I didn't talk about, so when we think about electrification, we also think hand in hand how that moves forward with our grid. And our grid today versus the grid that we need, which is substantially electrified today and substantially renewable. We're not on any coal. We have probably a third of our generation natural gas. We have one nuclear power plant that will eventually be mothballed in the next few years. And we have some standing hydro, and depending on our peak demand periods, we do import a certain amount of power, generally cleaner power, but that depends. There's a number of state laws that actually require over the next few years to transition our grid to a fully zero carbon neutral grid. That's really part of these basic calculations. Today, even with the current grid, and if you look at life cycle and electrification side, we're lower on the emission side. That work's been done, substantial work in that space has been done. But it's a great question because we actually need further gains. And if you look at the projection, where do we need to be both in terms of the electrification? And when I talk about cars, trucks, it's also ships. We electrify our ships at berth already in California. We have a reg to do that. But it's how the grid is moving along. And there's massive investments in California. I didn't talk about this either, that is looking to get at the downtime, the wildfire risk that has played itself out, particularly in PG&E's territory. So I talked about the $10 billion, which is a transportation ZEV focused. The actual climate budget is $47 billion. And a large share of that it's really in the hardening of the grid. It's basically, now this won't help us this summer. This summer is going to not go well. But 2 years, 3 years, the megawatts investment in backup power, in batteries, as well as a range of other renewables, that planning is underway right now in terms of both those investments and where we need to be with respect to the transportation sector. But it's a great question because those things go hand in hand. Because if we just moved the electrification part and stopped where we were in terms of our grid, even though our grid is clear, in fact, it's actually cleaner than probably even our heavy hydro states already, the requirements in law are to fully electrify or have a zero carbon footprint grid.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I could just add a little bit in terms of LA Metro's plans to transition its fleet to zero emission by 2030. And just to help kind of situate my role in this project is that in the Innovation Office, we're helping to identify what is the best delivery method for Metro to do this conversion. Is it through the standard design bid build approach where Metro does the design and then bids that out, or is it through some other alternative mechanism, maybe like a charging as a service model or a bus as a service model, that sort of thing. So we're looking at all of the spectrum of delivery methods and trying to identify what is, the most cost effective for Metro, that's going to deliver the best bus service of the future, that's going to deliver safety, all of that. And we're also looking at the life cycle in terms of waste or resource waste. Certainly one of the we're aiming for an accelerated achievement of this goal by 2030, but I believe that includes no early retirement. So we would be mitigating any issues around, say, retiring buses early and creating scrap before it would necessarily be the case. And then in terms of these battery electric vehicles, when they do roll out, there of course is concern about what happens to the batteries after their useful life. But in the IIJA, there are some programs in there that I think will lead to either better recycling that's happening with these batteries, as well as additional second life uses. And I know there's a lot of really important research going on with that. And I remain very hopeful that whatever batteries might be taken out of a vehicle, say at a midlife, would actually find a second life somewhere, perhaps even on Metro property somewhere, providing resiliency of its facilities and that sort of thing. So, that is yet to be determined, but I think that there's a lot of great work happening and a lot of good programs and research and development to identify, what would come of those batteries after their useful life on a vehicle. But that said, I believe that also, Metro's battery electric buses have extended warranties on their batteries as well, which allow them to operate for a pretty equivalent time compared to standard CNG vehicles right now, which is what our current fleet is.
Could you provide some perspective about the role of autonomous vehicles as part of addressing the climate crisis and particularly with ensuring a just and equitable transition? I think part of what's uncertain about the way autonomous vehicles are going to play out is, especially in the VMT space, if there's opportunities to reduce congestion, will that induce demand? Will autonomous vehicles reinforce existing inequities with mobility patterns? Like, what is it that we could do, I guess people in the room could do about thinking about what autonomous vehicles can do as part of this work?
For sure. I'm happy you asked that question, happy to talk about it. The way that I even structured the work that I did at Carnegie Mellon and moving forward in my new role is that we can have an equitable and just transition to this new technology, and that we can address some of the inequities that have happened through the creation of our infrastructure system, our highway system. And I believe that I believe that it's possible, especially when we are intentional about shared autonomous mobility and giving power to our transit agencies and planners to be a part of that conversation and determining where that need is. I think one thing, when we talk about even like current pilots, I think there's an opportunity to look at how we can improve equity right now with certain services. I know that companies might be like ready for their ROI, but I think there's actually probably a great economic opportunity as well in areas that are underserved right now by existing public transit. And so if there's a demand there that's being unmet, that means there's a market there that could be profitable potentially with service. And I think especially when done in tandem with public transit, so this private-public partnership potentially could provide, another P, a great opportunity for, again, that equitable, just transition. But I do think for practitioners, being intentional about how these systems are going to come into transit, thinking about how they can be shared and intentional and making sure they remain shared, I believe is a really great first step and path. And even when I think about deployment and piloting, it's also a great option for keeping things safer than giving everyone their own autonomous vehicle. So there's also an opportunity for some more constraints. So some version of a win-win when we think about it, or when I think about it in the way that I've kind of done so far. Anyone else?
I'll be brief, really brief. But I'm just going to reflect a little bit. I mentioned on the TNC, the Transportation Network Companies regulation that we had established a few years ago, back in 2020. One of the reasons for that was, one, to honestly transition TNCs to EVs. But part of it was what we were finding is a large share of the mileage was deadhead miles, right? They're just tooling around waiting for the next fare. And it was, how do we have a metric in place, which was passenger GHGs per passenger mile. So the deadhead ended up counting against them in the calculation. We're using a regulation. I said we're a regulatory agency. We're going to use those tools. So, one, we think about the role that autonomous vehicles will play in the TNC space. How establishing this metric we think will help is we've embedded it. We also are thinking about the metric embedded in the delivery space as autonomous vehicles play a progressively larger role in the delivery space. That's one that we are looking at, about what are the metrics and what are the tools by which we can get at that issue.
Let me actually add, I previously worked in accessibility, and one thing that I don't think transit practitioners give themselves enough credit for is how much they have had to adhere to Americans with Disabilities Act regulations since it was passed in 1990, because they have decades of experience figuring out how do you run a system that's accessible to as many people as possible in all the ways that disability can manifest, physical, intellectual, behavioral. They have a really deep bench of knowledge that needs to be disseminated and shared with the OEMs that are building these autonomous vehicles. At least the AVs that I have ridden on would benefit from some of that knowledge. And so to the extent that transit acknowledges that and will share that information and will insert themselves into some of those conversations, I think will be very beneficial so that we actually get designs that more of us are going to be able to ride.
Thank you. Alejandro, now I'm with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So as I do work, I usually start thinking about metrics, data, research, and real world applications. So I think the session started talking a lot about VMT reduction. My first thought is that the right metric, or is that the right thing to be measuring? And not to get into the argument whether or not VMT is good or bad, but I'd rather want to ask the plenary about, beyond the VMT, do you think about the quality of the VMT? Is that VMT in an electric vehicle or a low MPG vehicle? Is that VMT in a high occupancy vehicle or lower occupancy vehicle? Is that trip for a medical service, or is that trip for a recreational? So as we go, I understand the reason for doing it with just VMT, but I want to go deeper into the conversation if we really want to tackle the sustainability piece of these. And because this is a technology session, I also want to ask what type of technology are we using to collect the data that we need in order to move along, to do research and to move forward. So again, just thinking beyond just BMT, and also technology to collect data and really evaluate how we're doing.
Agreed.
I think that's a fantastic question. And in my mind, I go to this is not a metric at all, but mobility, and how do we as a transportation agency at LA Metro provide mobility. And mobility means accessibility to the places that people need to get to is one. Delivering also a really good customer experience for that as well. It also means what is congestion like that is, preventing people from being mobile across the county. And so I think, VMT is one input that goes into that, but it's a much larger picture. It has to do with land use as well. It has to do with density of jobs and housing. And so I would say it's not just VMT, it's a number of other inputs as well. But I see, Bill, you're nodding your head along in agreement. I should turn it over to you.
No, I mean, I'm not sure I have too much to add. I mean, in our region, the majority of auto trips are 5 miles or less. So there's a lot of trips that are happening that you would think are competitive for alternative modes, whether that be active modes or transit or some other form of travel. And I think, this has been sort of the billion-dollar challenge for us, over the last half century, is how do we address those trips in particular, where there are alternatives that might be competitive, and how do we make that happen? I think the new technology that has become available, especially autonomous vehicles, I think presents some challenges in some respects. If you do have sort of autonomous taxis available, if you walk around San Francisco today, you will see Waymo and Cruise, AVs being tested on every street corner. I mean, they are everywhere in the city. And most of them are EVs, some of them aren't. But, I think there's a concern that a lot of us have, I think at least in the Bay Area, because it's very much in our face, what is that gonna turn into? Is that gonna just become, more economical TNCs that make it cheaper for people to take short trips, which doesn't reduce VMT, to your question. So I don't know, I liked your metric about the quality sort of VMT. I think that's a really interesting concept, so yeah.
And I guess one other piece that I would add to this as well is a strategic goal at Metro is to reduce single occupancy vehicle trips, right, by 50%. So, that's another way to look at this as well, is how are we getting people out of their cars and onto transit, right, onto shared modes, or onto a bicycle instead. So that's another way, another data point that goes into this equation as well.
I'll just say, I love the metric that Bill mentioned was used when they were redoing buses, which is I want this percent of residents in this area to have, this level of access, and be able to walk this many minutes to a bus that comes this frequently in hours. I feel like that's a great measurable outcome to put in place. So we've got 4 minutes left before we have a 30-minute break with refreshments, I think, outside. So let me say this has been a great panel, and let me ask each of the panelists to give 1 or 2 closing remarks if they would like before we wrap up and send people on their way.
Start on that end.
I guess I'll just say I've enjoyed being here this afternoon. I mean, I think I work mostly on public transit, so that's definitely my area of focus. And, I think the pandemic has really presented a challenge that public transit has struggled to meet, honestly. The service quality across the country has really degraded in most communities, and that's going to be a really long-term challenge if we want transit to thrive and to provide mobility to the public. And I think one of the most important metrics that we should be looking at is the frequency and quality of that service. Richard brought up free transit, and that's a very hot topic in California right now because of a proposal from the governor to make transit free for a period of time. I would push back on that. I think the research, and there's been a lot of great research from UCLA, and I think someone from UCLA might be here who's worked on that research, that says that people will ride the service if the service is there, and it needs to be reliable and frequent. And that is really the key to getting people back on transit, more so than just whether it costs $2 or $0. So that's just what I would think is how can we center the recovery of transit around the customer and make the service work better for them?
I feel like I'm here to really share the thoughts of kind of the newer shiny things, and really recognizing that even electrification and automation are tools that can be used to address any of the goals or missions for transit agencies, for OEMs. I think that it's a tool for improving society. And so let's harness that tool and do some good. We have an opportunity here.
I'm going to try to synthesize both Bill and Alante's comments because absolutely more frequent, more reliable service is critical, but we need some of the new shiny things. We need the technology in order to achieve some of that. And so, again, where I sit in the innovation office, anybody out there that has thoughts, innovative concepts, project ideas for how we can accomplish that, our office is always open to talk about those opportunities to see how Metro might implement some sort of demonstration to achieve just that.
And I'll wrap on, I think, where I started earlier, which was I really believe that we are at a unique point in history from a transportation, from a technology standpoint, a funding standpoint, to do something here. I mean, it is going to be challenging. I mean, I've talked about the convergence of housing and climate and air quality and equity, this conversion. I see many of you in this space having an opportunity. I mean, to me, that requires doing our homework, doing the basic research, collaborating with a broad range of folks, also doing something. You're not going to get it right. I can assure you the mistakes will be made along the way you'll learn from. But it is not an era, to me, for 10 more years of research. It's like, get out there, do something, act, learn from it, modify and execute. So,
well, thank you to the panelists, and thank you to the number of audience members that had really thoughtful questions. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you all for try that again. Thank you all for joining us in this first session of the conference called Electrification, a Plan to Decarbonization. And like any good researcher, we are taking this as a question, not a statement. And so what you'll be hearing from our presenters today is some additional questions about policies and infrastructure development and planning, and looking at where we've been and where we may or may not be going, depending on how we move forward as a society at local, state, and federal levels. So we have joining us Adrian Heller from Cambridge Systematics, Matthew Bruhan from Carnegie Mellon University, Jessica O from Minnesota DOT, and Matt Dowse, who is at so many organizations in New York City. I will let him choose to identify how he pleases when he introduces himself later. We're going to hold questions till the end of the panel, so if you could just jot down notes with your questions for the first couple of panelists, and then we'll go into Q&A at the end. I'll turn it over to Adrian.
Thanks so much. Yes, as Alice mentioned, my name is Adrian Heller with Cambridge Systematics. I am an associate. I've been with Cambridge Systematics for about 2 years now. I'm actually filling in for another presenter who unfortunately could not make it today. So please throw me your hardest softballs. These days, most of my work focuses on electrification and on equity. And I have used the tool that I have presented today, so do feel free to ask questions on that. And with that, we will get going. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the evaluation of electrification incentives using the MA3T model. And we'll start off with a little bit of background on the project for which the model was used. This was for carbon-free Boston. We're going to describe the tools that were used for this electrification exercise at a fairly high level and describe possible pathways to a carbon-free Boston. So, Boston University reached out to Cambridge Systematics to help investigate transportation-generated GHG emissions. In Boston, transportation represents about 1/4 of all GHG emissions, equal to about 2 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent emissions. 3/4 of those emissions come from passenger vehicles, 15% from truck, and 10% from transit. So key strategies for reducing those emissions do target those passenger vehicles and focus on shifting trips away from them, reducing the number of them, or reducing their emissions by transitioning them to zero-emission vehicle technology. It's also important to note that in considering policy interventions, a major urban area like Boston is relatively limited in terms of what it can accomplish without coordinating with its neighbors. While passenger vehicles do represent the bulk of transportation emissions, less than 1/4 of those emissions are actually generated from within Boston. You can see that light blue area around the Boston urban area represents the vast majority of all the transportation-related emissions. Still, without action and based on those 2011 travel patterns, VMT is still expected to increase by about 3%. However, GHG emissions are still expected to fall by about 28% by 2030 and 40% by 2050. This 1.2 million metric ton decline is mostly a result of currently adopted federal and state fuel economy standards for light-duty vehicles and trucks. The carbon-free Boston analysis focused mainly on transportation policies and investment strategies that may be largely influenced by specifically the city of Boston, although some policies such as carbon pricing, transit investment, ride-hailing service regulation may require state or regional agency action. The project team relied on a sketch assessment model in the middle here to support the policy analysis, and we'll focus mostly on that today, as well as a spatial model to estimate changes in travel behavior. So, MA3T. I always love an excuse to talk about an Excel model. The MA3T model is the market acceptance of advanced automotive technologies. It was developed by Oak Ridge National Lab, and it simulates the very diverse purchasing behaviors among individuals in the marketplace. It was implemented using Excel for Windows, and it can simulate market demand for advanced vehicle technologies by representing relevant attributes of technologies and consumer behavior, such as technological learning by doing, range anxiety, access to recharging points, daily driving patterns, and willingness to accept technological innovation. And the good news is that it's available as a free download. So this very complicated model is really centered around the nested multinomial Logan model to predict purchase probabilities among 40 choices by consumer segments based on value components associated with vehicle attributes, driver behavior, infrastructure, energy prices, and policies. Segment purchase probabilities are translated into market share, sales, vehicle populations, petroleum use, and greenhouse gas emissions. And some of the outputs also serve as feedback signals. You can see that in the dashed line here on the model. And together with the exogenous inputs from various sources, they affect the purchase probabilities represented by the lines on that figure. The consumer segments are driven by census divisions, residential areas, attitude toward novel technologies, driving patterns, home recharging situations, and work recharging situations. Ultimately includes 40 choices consisting of 20 powertrain technologies for each of 2 vehicle size classes. And it considers the U.S. household users segregated into altogether more than 1,400 segments. The more simplified view shows the 4 key input groups that users can change within the MA3T model. And these focus on technology, infrastructure, consumer, and policies. Within the technology group, all of these are customizable inputs. For us, the key input was vehicle manufacture cost. Within policy, the most important for us, again, was instant rebate, or effectively a rebate that lowers the purchase price of the vehicle. Charge availability at home and work was key among the consumer group, and this also aligned with strategies that were in place already in the region. For infrastructure, our focus was on public charging availability. So just to give you a sense of what the model itself actually looks like, this is a screenshot of the actual model. You can see that there is support for saving the input files, loading customized files, running single or multiple runs. At the time that I used MA3T for a different project, we were advised by the developer not to use the calibrate feature. Changing inputs involves overriding those default inputs. Here, the default home charging availability is an estimate of the percentage of homes with covered parking. The share estimates are gathered by Census Division and each residential area from the 2005 American Housing Survey. It's important to note that MA3T has been updated since the 2015 model. So the scenarios that ultimately our project team modeled are on the screen here. We've got the base model that includes all of the baseline assumptions embedded within MA3T, lower charge equipment costs, reducing those home charging costs, public charging increased from 5% to 100%, lower vehicle costs, reduce those technology costs by 10%, instant rebate, a $5,000 instant rebate until 2030, in line with what many states are currently doing. Max home and work charge availability increased from 29% and increased to 100%. So what the model results ultimately showed for us is that lower vehicle costs is key for EV adoption, followed by home and work charge availability. Lower charge equipment costs are important, and that instant rebate plays a very large role until it expires in 2030 and pretty quickly declines there. For comparison to other business as usual projections, these scenarios are at least 50% higher than even the most optimistic forecasts that were available at the time. You can see here that the NROL electrification futures is the highest among those, and in general, then and now, EV projections are pretty much all over the map, with the annual energy outlook, the very bottom of the forecast here in orange, generally being the most conservative of all of the forecasts, either public or privately available. It's also important to note that MA3T is actually built on the annual energy outlook forecast. So what does all of this mean for Boston? Ultimately, for this project, we looked at 5 illustrative pathways, and of course, we need to follow pathway 5 with maximum policies to get even close to net zero by 2050, and even then there is a small gap that remains. So this figure shows how GHG reduction will evolve over time to meet those 2050 levels. With no additional policy action, GHG emissions do decline from approximately 2 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent in 2016 to just under 1 million in 2050. However, unmanaged smart mobility could increase that by approximately 50,000 metric tons. Combined transportation investment and strategies can reduce this by 50,000 tons of CO2e, and pricing strategies in particular are very effective and reduced by approximately 200,000 CO2 equivalent. The largest gain will be from electrification, with the efficiency benefits of EVs contributing more than 300,000 tons of CO2e, assuming the 2016 electricity grid, so some updates there, and an additional 300,000 with the Massachusetts Clean Energy Standard grid. The remaining 100,000 is due to heavy-duty vehicle emissions, which are, again, largely outside of the city's control. And those will need to be reduced by electrification or renewable fuels or offset in some other way. So there are a host of policy options that together play an increasingly important role in moving the needle on electrification, especially as more vehicles achieve cost parity. So more focus now, especially here in California, on zoning changes and land use changes, looking at accelerating policies and investments to implement things like clean, complete streets, improve the bike and pedestrian network. Testing policies to encourage multi-occupancy shared vehicle use is a big one, even with electrification. Curb space reprioritization, low-cost transit speed, and of course, focusing on public fleets. Beyond that, long-term, things like congestion pricing become more important to achieve, will become more attractive. And there's also a lot more need for large-scale investment across the board for both individual vehicles, transit, and for the charging infrastructure. So with that, I will say thank you. Really enjoyed the opportunity to share a presentation. I do encourage you all to read the full report. There is a lot of great information there. And if you do have any other questions, I'm very happy to take them and also to pass you along to the lead author there.
Great, thank you, Adrian. So now we're going to move over to a little bit of a broader perspective from Matthew.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. I'm excited to share this research today because I'll be discussing a paper that we finished a little over a year ago, but this is the first chance that we've really had to share it at a conference with a larger audience. By way of introduction, I'm a recent PhD graduate, as of 2 weeks ago, actually, from Carnegie Mellon. And the work that I'll be talking about today was co-authored with Jeremy Mahalik, who, like me, is in the Engineering and Public Policy Department, as well as by Inej Azevedo at Stanford University. And I want to start off the talk today with a question, which is, who pays for your car ride? So regardless of whether we're talking shared transportation or your private car, there are certain costs associated. And the numbers that you see here are estimates that we pulled for the city of Chicago. And these are specifically the marginal costs for each additional unit of vehicle travel. So private costs of operating the vehicle, things like gas maintenance and operation, in Chicago, they would sum to around 27 cents per mile. But there are also external costs, and by external costs, I'll use that term throughout the talk, I really just mean the unpaid costs of things like emissions that are not necessarily considered by the driver or by the person who's benefiting from the travel. So on the congestion front, lost time costs can sum to as high as $100 billion per year in the US. Emissions, which will be the focus of my talk today, within that issue, transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gases in the US. It passed the power sector several years ago. And transportation emissions also lead to around 20,000 pollution deaths per year. And finally, around 36,000 people per year die from vehicle crashes. So the takeaway here is simply that there are considerable costs that are not considered by the benefiters of travel. And this comes as no surprise to anyone in this room, but within the larger sphere of transportation, ride-sourcing fleets such as Uber and Lyft have quickly increased their share of total vehicle travel. In some places like San Francisco, there are estimates that 1/8 of total VMT might be from these fleets. And so we've started to see policies at the state and city level especially. Chicago has a congestion fee that they enacted in 2020. And as you heard in the keynote earlier today, California is enacting a clean vehicle standard specifically for TNCs. And so the core question of my research in this particular study is, are there any market failures that are caused by the fact that we don't pay the costs of emissions? So if we compare a case where the ride-sourcing fleet is simply minimizing its private operational costs versus a case where the fleet also is paying those emissions costs, particularly as a Pigovian tax, where we're just passing those costs directly on to the fleet. So if we see a distinction in the way fleets use EVs across those two cases, it doesn't necessarily mean we should drop what we're doing and create a carbon tax, but it does suggest there's some role for public policy, and specifically as a means to improve the economic efficiency of how these fleets operate. So next I want to walk through briefly how the model works. So we consider the decision making at the fleet level. This is one simplifying assumption we make, but we assume the fleet is centrally controlled. There's a fleet manager who can figure out the best way to minimize their costs, and that same fleet manager is choosing what vehicles to purchase. So on this slide, I'm going to illustrate a 30-minute time window in one city, just to walk through the kinds of decision making that we model. So the first question at hand is whether the fleet should choose battery electric vehicles, hybrids, or perhaps combustion vehicles. Simultaneously with those acquisition decisions, our model is also deciding which specific cars should be matched to which specific trips. If there were any battery electric vehicles in the determined fleet that minimizes costs, then the model also decides when those vehicles should charge. So in some cases, this is really just about when you have EVs free that don't need to be serving trips. Those are good times to charge the cars. But when we also consider the emissions costs, it depends also on the power grid and specifically what power plants are operating on the margin of the grid that might see an increased generation due to charging. So at a high level, our optimization model is minimizing the costs of operation. We look both at capital costs of vehicle acquisition, as well as fuel or electricity, as well as maintenance. We have a set of constraints that ensure that every trip is served by a car, that vehicles have to be purchased to be used, and also that the vehicles have to follow a logical path throughout the city. And specifically for battery vehicles, we have a separate set of constraints simply to track their charge level throughout the day and to make sure they don't run out of battery. So what this optimization gives us is, for a fleet that's centrally controlled, that's minimizing its costs, what's the optimal size of that vehicle fleet? So how many cars do you need? But also, should each car be battery, hybrid, or combustion? We also get specific vehicle routes. From those, we can compute things like VMT and emissions. Because this is an optimization, we have to put a dollar value on all of these things. So for greenhouse gases, we use a social cost of carbon suggested by the EPA. For health damages from things like particulate matter, we use 3 different reduced complexity models. Those take into account things like population density and things like airflow. The data set that we use in this model comes from a not-for-profit company called Ride Austin. They kind of jumped in to fill demand when Uber briefly left the city of Austin, and they made their data set public, which is really useful for us as modelers. So one of our test cases is the city of Austin, but simply to get a feel for variation across cities, we compare results for LA and for New York City as well. We don't have the same style of data, at least for LA. So what we do is reuse the Austin trip data, but we simply vary the costs of electricity, of gasoline, and we also vary the power grid operations by region. So next I want to dive into the results. And so the slide that you see here, what I'll show successively more of are different test cases, but the x-axis here is essentially the makeup of the fleet. So how many vehicles were purchased for each powertrain. The y-axis is going to show how heavily each of those powertrains was actually used. So taking the city of Austin as an example, when there is no tax being paid, so the fleet's minimizing private operational costs, the fleet, we estimate, would be majority conventional vehicle. The fleet would also purchase a handful of hybrids and a handful of battery vehicles, but it's worth noting that those electric vehicles would be used much more heavily. So these are the cars with low variable costs. They're going to be used almost 24/7 in some cases, whereas the conventional vehicles are mostly filling those peak demand times. In this particular data set, that's not commuting, it's more people going out on Friday and Saturday nights. So next we consider what happens when emissions are taxed, and it's a pretty drastic shift. So the fleet still purchases a tiny handful of conventional vehicles, but it's almost entirely electric. Hybrids are still used a little bit more heavily than battery vehicles, but it's close to a 50-50 split. Compared to Austin, Los Angeles has relatively high costs of gasoline. So what we can see in both cases in Los Angeles, we estimate that today it's already suboptimal to use gasoline vehicles. So even without considering emissions costs, battery vehicles should already be pretty favorable here, and hybrids would make up the remainder of demand. If we consider an emissions tax, the fleet shifts even more heavily towards batteries. Finally, in New York City, electricity costs and gasoline costs are both pretty high. So we estimate that, again, hybrids do have a key role to play in the fleet. Depending on whether the fleet considers emissions, they may still use a few gasoline vehicles, or those might be entirely crowded out. So the top level takeaway here is that there is a substantial shift towards electric vehicles when there's a tax on emissions. We did also consider how much of a burden this might impose on the fleets, not only in terms of the tax that they would be directly paying, but also, is this leading to operational costs and inefficiencies that might be really creating sticker shock for these fleets? So the plots that you see here are simply showing the increase in those acquisition costs plus the operational costs of the fleet. And what we were surprised to see is that there's very little impact on the operational costs from using more electric vehicles. Across all three of the cities with very different inputs, it's basically around 1%. And next we looked at, okay, so maybe this is a low cost solution, maybe it's low hanging fruit for decarbonization, but is it actually helping? And what we found is that external costs, depending on city, depending on things like fuel prices, the external costs of emissions should fall anywhere from 10 to 22%. So we're not talking about this necessarily as a pathway to full decarbonization, but it is $30 million per year in Los Angeles as one example. And across all of our sensitivity cases, that cost reduction could be as high as $130 million. And again, this is per year, per city. So what this tells us, the fact that there is a substantial shift towards electric vehicles when they consider emissions, what this tells us is that there is a substantial market failure here. And if we fix that kind of classical economics market failure, if we fix it, then electric vehicle usage, and particularly battery electric vehicle usage, goes way up. Depending on city and depending on assumptions, it might be as low as 5%, or it might be as high as 156%. And that's as a share of the total fleet VMT. And the emissions cost reduction is not 100%, but it is also not negligible. So we would say this suggests there is a role for public policy specifically to correct for this market failure and price in these external costs. Having said that, we also see across all of our sensitivity cases that there's never a test case that we've run that found the fleet should be 100% hybrid or 100% battery vehicle. The socially optimal fleet that's minimizing the emissions cost plus operational costs will always be, in this framing at least, some kind of a mixture of technologies, even if it's just hybrids plus batteries. And that exact mix varies substantially by location and by other factors that change over time. So this is not a one-size-fits-all situation. Lastly, I want to point out a few things to put this finding in context. One is that electrification is essentially always beneficial in our model, but it's not a panacea. So we still need to think about, one of the themes of today, it seems, is VMT reduction or improving the quality of VMT. So this could be things like shared ride services, or managing demand, or perhaps improving interactions with transit. Secondly, this is not a market failure that's entirely limited to ride sourcing. It affects private vehicle use as well. It's just outside the scope of this study. This particular study is cost minimization. It's really focused on economic efficiency, but we should keep in mind other reasons for public policy interventions. Things like the need for equitable access to clean air. And finally, we need more robust data sets from more cities. Given that this is not a one-size-fits-all solution, it would be great to see, every city start to publish more data about how ride sourcing fleets are used. So thank you for your time.
Great, we're sticking with the researcher line of we need more data. So asking questions, we need more data. I'm glad we're learning a lot of other details in between as well. So now we're going to switch over to talk a little bit more about the infrastructure away from the vehicle adoption with Jessica O.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jessica O. I am the Minnesota Department of Transportation Strategic Partnerships Director. I think we're going to take a little bit of a left turn from our last few discussions and talk about decarbonization opportunities a little bit more broadly, a little bit more specific to use of right-of-way. It's a pleasure to get a chance to be with you today. Okay, let me make sure I know how to use this. There we go. Okay, I'm here today to introduce you to a feasibility study that was recently released by a coalition, a group of partners that was led by the RAY, which is a 501c3 nonprofit that has the mission of zero deaths, zero waste, and zero carbon. You might be familiar with some of their work. If you're not, they're a very interesting national thought leader on how to layer, these advanced technology solutions in a way that really supports the future of transportation. And so MnDOT with the RAY and NGI Consulting, has been working together on a feasibility assessment, asking the question of, can we use highway right-of-way for buried HVDC transmission? And so here today, I'm going to share with you a little bit more about the sort of practical and internal and cultural aspects of this experience for MnDOT. So for those of you that are not familiar with Next Generation Highways is the concept of the strategic co-location of buried HVDC electrical transmission lines with communications infrastructure. So broadband and 5G and other communications infrastructure with EV charging infrastructure. So again, it's the strategic co-location, it's the layering of solutions that's really being strategic around these investments, being furthered by the RAY. MnDOT came to this work through our Sustainable Transportation Advisory Council, our STAC, really helps guide and advance our work in GHG reduction activities at MnDOT. They approached the MnDOT and asked that we analyze this concept. And so as of last summer, we really activated a group of internal leaders and multiple state agencies to see, is this model possible? What are some of the opportunities and some of the barriers? So this was very much a proactive planning project underwritten by philanthropy, and the actual feasibility assessment has multiple levels of analysis. It sort of used Minnesota highways and Minnesota DOT as a kind of a case study, but there were also deep dives into Wisconsin and national level analysis. So the primary question is really taking a step back and asking, can we cite transmission infrastructure, specifically buried transmission infrastructure in highway right-of-way? The reasons for doing this are really significant. First off, for those of you that might not be familiar, hopefully you are in the work that you're doing in working with utilities and the concerns around the grid and electrification, but just generally, it's a significant issue that transmission, siting, and new transmission lines have extensive development timelines. So if you're not familiar, the average transmission line can take 8 to 10 years to bring to fruition, from land ownership issues to public opposition, you name it, to the sort of administrative processes. It is a very intensive and long process, that is holding back advancing of our grid. And then generally, as you guys have noted, especially from our speakers since this afternoon, that transportation electrification will have significant impacts on the grid. I think we all can acknowledge that, from medium to heavy duty electrification all the way up. There will be significant needs for upgrades to the grid to have the capacity to respond to electrification. So the goals for our study were very much to evaluate the right-of-way, specifically the technical, regulatory, the economic barriers to burying these transmission lines and highway right-of-way. Currently in Minnesota, we are operating off this the environment where, this is currently prohibited in Minnesota. So like many states, longitudinal utilities are of course prohibited in those interstate and, controlled access environments. And so we were undertaking this analysis knowing that there would be significant statutory changes that would need to occur if we were to really eventually realize buried transmission. Interestingly, I think that we really sought to leverage this opportunity in this analysis to break down silos at our DOT. So I'm sure if any of you work in transportation environments, there are no silos where you work. Maybe in Minnesota we have a couple. And we had an opportunity to really bring together different stakeholders who, if we were thinking really strategically around, connected autonomous vehicles, around broadband gaps currently, around future communication needs, ITS, you name it, the interests in our agencies don't always talk to each other and aren't always strategic around how we look at public-private partnership opportunities, how we really leverage these opportunities for investment, because there are significant gaps in our system, and we will never realize full electrification or full connected autonomous vehicles until we, better connect these dots. So this was an opportunity for us to have very practical breaking down of those silos and really bringing also our Public Utilities Commission and our Department of Commerce to the table to talk about what that would mean for siting or permitting of transmission in our highway right-of-way. So for those of you that might not be familiar, the general question, if you come away with anything, I hope that you can understand a few high-level talking points around why new transmission is needed in this country. As transportation professionals, we are not utility or grid experts, and so I think it's important to understand the increasing transmission needs just more broadly. So first off, you may or may not be aware that in the United States, there is almost no interregional transmission. The biggest examples of this that I think are the most recent and the most jarring are that because we don't have interregional transmission, we can't move power when we have climate crisis and climate emergencies. As many of you saw, the huge human cost that resulted from the situation in Texas and the huge human suffering that occurred there as a result of their grid issues. And subsequently, the New Orleans grid was knocked out by hurricanes shortly after. You name it, there are climate crises that have significant transmission impacts, and we do not have a smart grid in the United States. We do not have an interregional grid that can move power efficiently. not only can we not move power efficiently, we can't move clean power efficiently. So the implications of the lack of a smart grid in our country are significant. You know, because we also just generally have insufficient transmission is preventing renewables from coming online to the grid more, effectively and efficiently. So the average regional transmission operator in the Midwest, we have MISO, which is 15 Midwestern states. They have a huge queue of renewable projects that want to get in onto transmission, and they currently have a backlog. So there's a significant issue with connecting the timing around connecting renewables. In general, you know, as we've seen from all of our electrification discussions from the last few hours, the need for transmission, the need for electrification, it's only going to increase, right? So in the next, 30 years or so, it's estimated that the need for transmission capacity will double or triple. And that will require a lot more transmission lines to be built to keep up with that for both electrification of transportation, but also electrification of our economy more broadly. So, transmission, the direct benefit, the direct connection to our work here is, of course, that we are in the timelines where we must start planning for these grid improvements and upgrades. Just had an interesting discussion with a colleague around the NEVI planning, and we're deep in that in many states around the National Electric Vehicle program and the need to really work very closely with utilities and public utilities commissions to plan these investments. Our partners and consultants like to point out in our 20 and 50-year transportation plans, we don't mention any of these needs. So we have the need to really get ahead of these opportunities now. The planning timeline is really now for these grid upgrades. So this is the researchers, this is a SEAM study that was analyzing the presence of the interstate highway system and the known transmission needs. So when you sort of overlay these two, you see that where the populations are, where the connections between grids happens to have a pretty strong overlay in many instances with the interstate system. So there's a huge opportunity there that could be utilized to bury transmission to advance transmission. So released in April of this year was our feasibility study. Generally, the outcome of our research was that it can be cost effective to site buried high voltage transmission in highway right-of-way as long as we are really building and planning for those future transportation system needs. So I would encourage many of you to check out this report, very detailed, lots of different topic areas that we do a deep dive into. We're going to stay high level for today. So just for those of you that aren't familiar with HVDC technology, there are many projects that are in Europe and Asia that are being buried. It offers great environmental benefit and efficiency and, undergrounding. It offers climate resilience benefits. The average footprint for a buried transmission line is typically about 5 feet by 5 feet or so within the right of way with a concrete barrier and thermal backfill. So, we had a crash course in advanced transmission technology, which was very new for us. It's definitely not our area of expertise, but we need to increase our partnership with utilities if we're going to prepare for these sustainability challenges. I can't emphasize the need for partnership enough. So here's a few areas of analysis that we did sort of dive into. We had many questions around the safety of actually how could we do the work of transportation around a buried, a $3 billion buried transmission line, and sort of spoke to those specs. We did a deeper dive into our existing utility permitting process and what the barriers would be to utilize our existing framework with buried transmission and what are the differences there. We had significant concerns around, currently we bear the cost when we have to relocate utilities on interstates. And, you don't relocate a $3 billion transmission line, right? Just here, willy-nilly. So, we would have to do some significant planning to ensure that we were really prepared for the future. And then just generally, we had some questions around authority. Our Public Utilities Commission manages transmission siting. We have oversight over our right-of-way. We had some sort of legal questions around how do those pieces fit together? What would environmental analysis look like? And we realized that we would have to do some significant coordination that would expand both our process and policies and their process and policies with the Public Utilities Commission. So our, what was, as research tends to do, our first round report, of course, uncovered dozens more questions that we need to dive into. And so we're entering into our phase 2 of our work scope to really analyze the full statutory picture from, P3 authorizing statutes to how we value the right-of-way, to utility accommodation policy, to, you name it, what could be the right instruments to make sure that if we did allow a buried transmission line, that we could really cover some of our basic oversight and operational expenses. I think that was a significant concern for our team. We're also going to get into really the specifics of possible routes and GIS analysis with known transmission needs based upon our MISO, our regional transmission operator. And, Wisconsin currently allows above ground transmission in their right of way. So we feel that we have a lot to learn from them of their last 20 years of analysis and just deeper alignment with the broadband and communication elements. This first phase was really focused on transmission. The second phase, we're going to really add in a much deeper assessment of the broadband needs. And that really gets deeper into our current ITS needs and our future ITS needs that will impact CAV, Connected Autonomous Vehicles. So generally, we think that broadband issues and opportunities and transmission opportunities and issues are not that different. And so we were really seeking to align those interests through our next level of analysis, and then just have many more stakeholders at the table, really have a preliminary process before we would even have a proposal before us. And then just a few other final quick slides in closing, just by way of an advertisement. Minnesota's hosting a Federal Highways Peer Exchange coming up in a month or so that's seeking to have this conversation around how we leverage this precious asset of right-of-way for these future needs. So electrification, CAV, transmission. We're seeking to have what someone at Federal Highways described as a unicorn conversation of interdisciplinary, of trying to get all these different disciplines in the room to talk about barriers and opportunities and breaking down these silos so we can be much more strategic in our investments and our approach, which I think will only preserve resources, dig once, and just have a much more efficient use of our right-of-way. So if anyone's interested in joining us, there's still open slots coming to St. Paul here in a month or so. So again, the top policy topics that we hope to really unpack in great depth are around broadband, valuation of right-of-way, those resource sharing and bartering opportunities, emerging utility accommodation policies and approaches, which covers NEVI and some of those areas that many DOTs are spending a lot of time right now meditating on what NEVI means for our policies, and just potential partnership models if we were to realize an actual proposal for a transmission line. With that, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jessica. I love it when people go out and learn a lot from stakeholders that are hard to coordinate with and then share with the rest of us. It's really incredibly helpful. We're going to transition back to some conversation around ride hail with Matt Dowse, focusing more on New York City this time.
All right. We all locked and loaded here? Oh, there we go. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. The last speaker here, and I know we're going to have a chat after this, but I want to say hello to all the live streaming folks. We're fortunate enough to be live streamed right now. This conference is an important one. It's been in the making for a number of years, and a lot of things have changed. Alice and I were just talking about how if it would have actually been held before the pandemic, right, we were talking about how it might actually be something that we're calling for change and for money when now we actually have the money, or at least some of it to jumpstart things with the infrastructure bill. So just so you understand my perspective, I have a lot of hats I wear. I'm the former longest serving New York City Taxi Limousine Commissioner. So I ran that agency and I was general counsel of the agency for a long time, 14 years, 20 years in city government in New York City. This is why I talk so fast. I'm also from Brooklyn. I'm an academic as well, though I consider myself not really a researcher, but more of a practitioner. I was a distinguished lecturer for many years at the City University of New York. I'm now Transportation Technology Chair at the Transportation Research Center at City College at CUNY. And I've been teaching sustainable transportation now for close to a decade. Every single semester, we sit down, we open up those textbooks, and I teach graduate engineering and planners, and I'm a lawyer, which makes it even more interesting. A lawyer and a former policy person from government, talking to engineers and planners about, the future of the planet and how we make these changes with someone who has expertise in regulating ride hails, paratransits, limos, black cars, taxis, all of these different vehicles that are really causing a lot of the problems out there from an emission standpoint. So we're going to talk about solutions here today. I'm also a transportation lawyer, so I specialize in regulation at a full-service firm. We do consulting, we do work for governments, for private industry, in all modes and all types of law. So we have a very well-rounded approach, and I kind of look at things from a different angle. I worked in government. I saw how the sausage was made. I made some sausage, probably not enough. Now I'm in the academic world, and now I'm representing people on the other side. So, and to that end, I also still represent the regulators. I've been president since 2009 of the ITR, which is like the equivalent of AASHTO, APTA, or NACTO for taxi and TNC regulators, including the PUC from California and all the different state and local agencies all over the world that regulate taxis and TNCs. So obviously I'm going to be focusing a little bit about not just New York, but in particular about how EVs and the whole infrastructure problem in our industry need to have a big heavy lift ahead of them. Now this infrastructure money is great. I'm waiting for the guidance to see how it comes down. There's a lot of money rolling around. It's a great way to kind of jumpstart it, but it could be wasted if we don't coordinate well and we don't have a lot of different players at the table to get things done at the state and local level. And also, just because we're going OV and EV, I don't think my students, I would have this debate all the time with them. They're like, I would ask the same question, by the way, in class every time. And I got the same answer from different students all the time. And most of them come wearing their helmets, they bike to class. Nobody owns a car except for the people that live in Staten Island, which is kind of like the country in New York City. But outside of that, most of the students would come there and they were anti-car, saying that cars are part of the problem. We need to get rid of all of them. We need to be on scooters and mopeds and taking public transit, right? So I would hear this time and time again. I would say, well, what if we can just get like EVs and everybody could have an EV and there's no emissions anymore? Well, what's the problem? No one really kind of had an answer to that, except they would go into the whole analysis of what goes into making an electric vehicle, right? And does that hurt the environment or not, right? But barring that technicality, there are other issues that come along with mitigation of congestion, which are important because even though we have EVs and tons of them and we can turn all the roads into EVs, does that make life better for people? If we have more and more cars. So the importance of shared mobility and making strides towards those goals before we turn into a complete EV culture, which is kind of happening on its own. There was a point in time when we didn't know what the type of fuel was going to be. Okay, CNG, hydrogen fuel cell. There was a point in time, even 15 years ago, we weren't sure which direction we're going. We know we're going in the direction of EVs now. So now we can plan ahead for it. But, all of these students, they would raise their hand and tell me that, we take Uber and, we take cars and because we're sharing. And we feel that that's the best way to help the environment. Well, that's true. The problem is that the devil's in the details. To use all those vehicles more efficiently and to share them is very, very hard. We saw that even with the pandemic, whatever strides that we made, that we took one step forward and 10 steps back. My former boss, Bloomberg News has, some, sour projections. There are some proprietary data that they relied on in their report. And even if you plan out to 2040, which is well beyond where some of the projections are, where city and states, including California, want to see a full EV complement, you're talking about still private miles traveled with private vehicles is going to far outstrip shared mobility or even automated vehicles when we get there. But let's take a step back because I was there at the beginning of the battle. Mayor Bloomberg and I worked together on a project, and I helped work on the transportation component of what we know now as Plan YC, which was the sustainability plan for New York. It was one of the first of its kind. And, you know, I caution cities and states because we got burned. We put a mandate for all cabs to become hybrid electrics at the time when that was the preferred technology and the direction we wanted to go, and we got sued. Went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and we lost at every level because of the Clean Air Act and EPCA, which say that cities and states, as California knows very well, legally cannot put emissions targets on any of their policies. They can do incentives, but they can't. We couldn't mandate that hybrid electric vehicles be part of the fleet, and we lost. But in the interim, because of the high prices of fuel back in the 2000s when this all happened, we did eventually, because it makes common sense, get the industries to turn over their fleets to the point now where if you look just last 2 years ago, 59% of all the yellow taxis are hybrids, 42% of the green taxis are hybrids, and 20% of all FHVs. Unfortunately, battery electric vehicles and plug-ins are only less than 1% of both fleets. So we got a little bit, we're still testing things out in this industry. After I left in 2013, they started with a pilot program at the TLC with the Nissan Leaf. And, you know, the same issues that, one of my first official act when I became general counsel of TLC was to get rid of a CNG mandate, because when the predecessors in the 90s at the TLC worked with the former mayor to get the utilities on board and to get CNG charging stations, they passed rules saying that the TLC fleets have to convert to a certain number of vehicles that are CNG fueled. Well, lo and behold, all the promises that the utilities made never came true. So all of the fleets were unable to charge their vehicles. And the problem in the taxi industry and the TNC industry is that time is money for drivers. So they're not going to wait online for an hour to charge their cars. And they were waiting for hours and hours because there are only 10 charging stations for CNG. So I had to scrap the whole program when I came in. And then things kind of came back on the Bloomberg, and we did the hybrid electric program. And then after I left, it kind of, went into a silent mode, and they've just been tossing and turning in the sheets about what they're going to do with EVs. And it wasn't until recently that we made any progress. The big problem why the Nissan Pilot failed is because of range anxiety and a lack of infrastructure. Now, this is not news to anybody. It's a chicken and egg thing. If you don't have infrastructure, you can have all the EVs in the that you want to sell. Who's going to buy them, and where are they going to charge them, right? And this is the biggest and only problem that we face right now. I don't think there's an issue with manufacturers making these things. They're probably going to get much better now that they focus on battery technology. For years and years, I don't know if a lot of people noticed, but GM and Ford had to buy the hybrid technology from their competitors in Japan because they did everything they could to block progress and the purchase of some of these hybrid electrics when they first started coming out. So when we had the Great Recession and we had all these problems with the high prices of fuel years ago, the Japanese automakers really had the upper hand. So we're in a position now where for the first time in the last 10, 15 years, we've been really focusing on battery R&D, and the manufacturers have the vehicles there. Now, the biggest issue now is where we go from here in our industries. And we put another pilot program in place at the TLC. That's coming to an end. They'll probably declare success. They have all these different vehicles, the Tesla Model Y, the Kia Niro, the Ford Mach-E on the road. There's a company that is doing, charging infrastructure called Gravity on the yellow cab side. We had a cap in place in New York City where we limited the number of vehicles on the road because Uber and Lyft got too big. There was an exemption for EVs that my predecessor got rid of. So now, any chances of getting AVs on the road, which Revel was trying to do with an employee model where the gig workers actually had jobs and benefits, has now been jettisoned. So they only got 50 cars on the road because the TLC was concerned that Revel's going to be the next Uber, which they are not. They were looking to do a good thing. So there's all these political situations that are floating around. It was completely the result of unrelated politics to EVs. It was the result of Uber and Lyft getting too big in New York City, drivers committing suicides that own medallions, and no politician, especially the progressive ones that force, the union agenda in New York City and elsewhere. We're not going to do anything to hurt the drivers. It's all about the drivers these days, right? So here's a business model that helps the drivers, puts EVs on the road, but we're concerned that they're going to get too big. I mean, some of the rationales for some of these policy decisions are beyond me at this point. And outside of New York City, there's really very little being done. It's only by the goodness of the hearts and the souls of the various taxi companies. Like in Madison, Wisconsin, they have Green Cab putting Model 3s on the road. In Columbus, we have 200 taxis with Columbus Yellow Cab. These people aren't told they have to do this. They're doing it because it's a money-making opportunity where they can build infrastructure on the property that they own, where all the cabs are, and they can open it up to the public, make money on charging. What people don't understand about the fleets, and this brings me to my point on TNCs, is that this industry, which makes up a lot of VMT on the roads, is a unique one where the drivers of the vehicles own the cars and they're independent contractors. So people have this vision of the sitcom Taxi, where you have this dispatcher sitting up there, which is still kind of the case. You're barking orders at the cab drivers, and they come out in their shifts, and all the vehicles are owned with and looked at by mechanics every 12 hours. That's not what the industry is anymore. The industry, both Uber, Lyft, limousines, black cars, taxis, are predominantly vehicles that are owned by individual drivers who are not rich by any means, who don't have the money to buy an EV, right? And you could mandate, like California's trying to do with the PUC by 2030, all the TNCs to make these vehicles electric and reduce emissions, but they don't own them. And you know why they don't own them? Because they can't, because they'll be sued for hundreds and millions of dollars, because these independent contractor drivers now are claiming they're employees and they're going to court. We've had Prop 22, which you may remember out here. This is the essence of the problem that we have. Uber and Lyft have hundreds of thousands of vehicles that their driver partners are using, but they can't control a darn thing. Or the best they can do is offer incentives. I mean, what are they going to, give them money so they can buy the cars? That'll be used against them in court too. So we have a problem with the gig economy and the way this industry is structured that is an impediment to getting them to become EVs. It is a huge and serious problem. So like Uber is pledging by 2030, of course, that's what the clean air standard that California passed at the PUC says too. They're going to have their drivers eligible for an extra $1 on every Uber trip, right? Does that mean they're going to necessarily buy EVs? Not necessarily. There's a leasing model now that's developed over time, Avis, Hertz, and others now, because the drivers are in the driver's seat. They don't even want to own the cars anymore. So now you have rental companies buying the cars, which could be a path to making them all EVs too. Hertz had pledged to buy, I think, 100,000 Teslas to be used around the country. So that's going to really be the answer, is that not Uber and Lyft doing these things and Via. It's going to be really the companies that own the cars and lease them to the drivers, turning them into EVs, which some of them have pledged to do. Okay, we got to finish up. So anyway, I'll finish up by talking about how we get this done. Right, we have cities and states looking to do stuff. We have private sector innovation. We have partnerships. What we're going to see, I think, is more and more cities doing things, because the federal government, they can give out money, but that's pretty much all they can do. Federally, constitutionally, their role is really limited. It's up to cities and states who control all of this. And so you got all these cities coming up with these goals of emissions and cutting the size of their fleets. And you have, like, Blue LA is an interesting concept with charging stations in LA as an example. All the AV companies are all pledging to use EVs, right? That's the direction they're going in, especially because EVs make sense when you don't have a driver and the car is used continuously. And state and local incentives are here, but we need more of them. I'm going to give a talk on Thursday about congestion pricing and how we could be using incentives and disincentives in that framework to help us. But, clearly this is a map of the various grants and subsidies and tax credits that are out there, but we need more of them. And we also need, I think, which is really critical, not just more infrastructure, but infrastructure that's consistent across various manufacturers and that could be used by everybody. There are some companies that are ahead of others, some that don't work well with others. And unless we have a standard that applies to all and their fast chargers, it's never going to work in this industry. People are not going to sit around and wait more than 8 minutes, which I think is the average amount of time it takes to refuel for a cab driver or a TNC driver. And we're out of time, but I think really I'll end on this saying that public-private partnerships and getting all the stakeholders to the table are really, really critical. You know, this is not a decision or something that can happen, even though CARB has done a great job, and the governor in California is way ahead of everybody else, the feds. This is a matter, this is more of a grassroots movement. You know, you've heard of charrettes and you've heard of how they do policy in South America. You really kind of need to get the people involved, because we're the charging infrastructure, mobility hubs, it's all local. Like, and someone raised at the opening session public transit. The future is all about public transit integrating with the TNC and taxi ecosystem to provide first and last mile partnerships. Really where these EVs should be for equity purposes, they should be charging stations in poor communities where there's a 3-fare zone or a 2-fare zone, where that person comes home from their late shift, can't get home, has to call an Uber or a Lyft, and it takes them $15 to $20 after they've paid $2 to take a subway. You know, there should be a subsidy there and an arrangement where the cars are all lined up and they're ready and waiting and they're charging there. And these are the things that I think are going to make things work. And some of these partnerships that have been taking place with Atlas Public Policy, I would keep an eye on. The pandemic kind of put them on the back burner. But it involves TNCs working with nonprofits, working with local governments to come up with plans at mobility hubs and elsewhere to make EV infrastructure make sense, because you can't put it everywhere at once. So we need to target it and use this money that's coming from the feds wisely, and do it in a way where you can look at some other international examples, not necessarily China, because China is not a democracy and they just tell people, the entire fleet, they had to convert over and it gets done. You know, I think one international exemplar I will end with, that's Montreal's Taxi Tio project. They took something known as Taxi Bonjour and they painted all of these EVs, Taxi Tio was the name of the company, with the same logo, and they put the EVs in the charging stations, and they created a movement in Montreal, and it's recently been relaunched as a project where they tied the tourism industry and a love of the city and for EVs and clean air into one project where multiple city agencies and the tourism industry was involved. These are the type of things we need to be doing together. And I'll end on that because I know we want to go to Q&A now. But we can do it, but everybody's got to work together. We can't be siloed. This industry has been siloed for years. You know, we've had public transit not talking to my members at ITR, okay? You know, now those barriers are being broken down with the mod partnerships with FTA. We need to go in a direction where we all collaborate, and it's going to be from the ground up. It's not going to be from the top down. So the state can say whatever they want to do and what they're going to do. It's really going to be up to the communities and the mayors that are going to make this happen, in my opinion. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Matt. Those of you who were here for the last session, you know that there are microphones in both staircases, so if you have a question, please get up and go to the mic. I have tons of questions. Before I get there, we need to find a session to send Matt to so that he does not call it a technicality when thinking about the life cycle of the EVs and the impact on the environment.
Sorry.
But I'm not sure that's a question that we're going to be able to answer in this panel, so I'm going to move on to talking about some of the economic elements that you guys mentioned. And we talked a lot about incentives and what incentives can do for getting the market to where, from an environmental standpoint, we see a big shift in switching over from those internal combustion engine and diesel vehicles to electric vehicles. And I'm wondering, how do you guys, since I realize that the point here is thinking about adoption, but because many of you are also policy people and policy experts, when we mix that with also the needs for funding, and right now we do have this great bastion of funds coming in from the federal government through the new infrastructure law. A lot of that is capital funds. We have seen, you know, ever since we built the highway system, that maintenance of large infrastructure projects is something that is difficult to keep up with. So moving forward with all of these incentives that you see as a great idea and really helpful for getting us to one place where we need to be, how do we balance that with making sure we are funding the infrastructure that we are building along with it?
I can attempt to take that one. So in my view, one of the key roles of incentive structures, and particularly public policy incentives, is to change the decision-making horizon. So in my study, for example, we saw, if you run this optimization model, it seems like BEVs are already a great idea for a lot of people. So why haven't we seen that yet? The answer is drivers aren't necessarily making financial decisions from a spreadsheet, thinking about their, payback periods. They're thinking about how much money they have now. And so the more we can think about incentives to either provide financing earlier or to somehow change that decision-making calculus, I think that's definitely one role of incentives.
So thinking of it more as a short-term solution that would then be adjusted once we get to adoption rates that we see as closer to those targets.
Perhaps. So anything that can make that decision-making longer term, reducing the barriers to entry for people who might want to own a battery vehicle. And I do think the charging infrastructure is also one barrier to entry that the bipartisan infrastructure law can help with.
Anyone else want to take a stab at that?
I guess I would also, and I don't have a microphone, I'm sorry, I'll just try to holler, but.
Actually, if you don't mind going up to the podium for the live stream audience that we have, I think.
Hello. I guess my hot take on this is that I think that the incentive money available through IJA and that many states, chief among them California, have made available for things like electric vehicles is a fantastic contribution. But we are coming very fast to a point where electric vehicles will achieve cost parity with internal combustion vehicles. Supply chain issues are a major factor right now. Once those get resolved, I think that we'll see the landscape change a lot. And so I would say that one of the things that have certainly been on my mind as I work my way through a number of these NEVI plans is what's the next role for incentives? Once you have that cost parity, the next question is going to be transitioning that money over to charging infrastructure. And then, thinking about sort of getting to all of these very ambitious goals, it doesn't necessarily involve passenger vehicles at all. So, I think one of the most exciting things about this electric vehicle technology is the sort of the trickle down technology that's being made available to other modes, thinking about things like scooters and e-bikes. It's not just for kids anymore. Guess what? You can now take your kids to school on your bike, and you can stop by IKEA and get your furniture and take it home with you and just charge overnight, and you're good to go. So I think that, it's going to be a really rapidly moving target. And so I would just say that my response to that would just be to be nimble and to think about everything in a very different context. And I think a lot of transportation funding has traditionally been done.
Yes.
I'm from Iowa State University, and I'm also an EV owner. So in Iowa, so you have been talking about incentives. In Iowa, as an EV owner, you actually pay every year additional fee to account for the fuel tax that you don't pay for the road. So I wonder, so in some of the studies that you have done, have you looked at that, the impact, and just in general, what's your view on you want to incentivize people to adopt EV, but on the other hand, they use a road and they're not paying the fuel tax, and what is the trade-off between the two?
Yeah, so I would say ideally the taxes would be levied on the road users who might be impacting the roads. And if we're also concerned about things like emissions, then those taxes should be targeted differently. So I guess traditionally the road use taxes are funding things like road expansion. But if we're then paying an additional tax as an EV owner, this is perhaps discouraging greener cars. And so, I've heard some discussions about we should decouple taxes for things like emissions impacts from gasoline from the taxes that we pay that fund roads, right? Because EVs, even if they are good for the environment, they're not necessarily free of impacts, especially if we're talking, you know, an electric vehicle, Hummer, for example, it might cause a little bit of road wear in a way that you wouldn't see from, you know, a Honda Civic, just because it is so much heavier.
All right, thank you. We bounced back and forth a little bit between talking about privately owned vehicles and shared fleets. And so I'm curious if anybody has been thinking about the interaction between those two, whether it's highway infrastructure, local incentives. I think one of your charts, Matthew, showed that you could have a huge number of vehicle miles by the cleaner vehicles. That would probably lead to some sort of model that meant people were sharing the vehicle as drivers, not just as riders. So when we're thinking about adoption rates and the infrastructure planning needs, how do those differ between privately owned fleets and shared fleets, and what do you see those interactions being?
Yeah, so I would say it depends a lot on the use level of any individual vehicle, at least in the modeling approach that we took. And so if you're thinking about, for example, we want to get TNCs to 100% EV, just because of the way the demand looks, you will still need more cars perhaps at 1 a.m. on a Friday night than you need at, you know, 3 p.m., right? And so you would probably want to find outside uses for those vehicles, maybe doing things besides ride sourcing, right? Maybe this is food delivery, maybe it's paratransit, maybe it's other things.
Is that something, I wonder, Adrian and Jessica, in your stakeholder engagement for your, you know, specific locations and use cases, has it been more towards shared fleets, whether that's trucking corporations or Uber, Lyft, or government fleets, or if it's more centered around conversations around the general public and what that looks like?
Just Minnesota hasn't engaged in that level of analysis yet. That's sort of our next level phase, so I can't speak to that.
Got it.
I don't recall the approach for carbon-free Boston, but I suspect that the answer probably lies in looking at the different duty cycles for the different vehicles. I know that another challenge with fleets in general is that right-sizing the initial capital purchase is really critical because they tend to need a less sort of luxury vehicle than your typical consumer. I think that's another case where I think the market evolving is going to play a big role as more kind of reasonably priced or sort of less luxury models become available for EVs. I think that fleet adoption will probably pick up a lot, but I think another, you know, a big question in all of that is just sort of how much use are those vehicles being, what are the duty cycles of the different vehicles look like? I think that a consumer that tends to just commute to work and is charging overnight is going to have a very different type of charging need than an Uber driver where that vehicle is mostly in circulation.
Got it, great. So I'm going to go back to the Minnesota stakeholders then. I think the other three speakers also spoke about the difficulties of breaking down silos, which you mentioned, and it sounds like you have moved towards breaking some of those down, and that the event you're having later this summer is working towards that. What have you found to be a successful way to be able to get there?
That's a great question. I think that, you know, just industries, we speak with such jargon. And even our first speaker today, when he was talking about partnering with housing, so my background is in housing and community development. And, you know, I think that when we seek to form these partnerships, when we seek to solve complex problems, when we seek to leverage resources from non-traditional sources and really have everyone at the table, we have to lose the jargon. We have to have frank conversations around our interests. We have to engage all levels of the organization. If you have people, you know, on the front lines versus leadership
speaking different languages or not engaged or having very different opinions about what needs to occur. It's not helpful. But I think it's well worth the time that it takes to understand each other's priorities and goals before you try to have the complex conversations about implications. So I think to me, one of the takeaways from today, just in general too, is that these partnerships can be really transformative and we need to be investing in more. And if we don't, it's an echo chamber within transportation. It just doesn't help us advance our goals.
Got it. Over here, sure.
So within electric vehicles, is there any technological innovation that you're really excited about? Maybe something that you haven't considered for your current work? I think, for example, of solid-state batteries. I don't know a lot about that. So if you could comment on any exciting things that are happening within technology, and also, where do you think we are when it comes to Moore's law in electric vehicles? Is there still a lot of room for improving, or just your general thoughts on technology and innovation?
So it's a little bit outside of my area, but one thing that I am following closely is energy density, simply because one of the big design constraints from a high-range EV right now is the weight of the battery. And the higher we can get that energy density, the better everything will be from a design standpoint, especially for things like, medium and heavy-duty cars where the battery might need to have lots and lots of capacity.
Your research, like improvements on density of
Yeah, so in my study, it's a study we started in 2017, and even since the start of that study, things have changed a lot. So we picked a pretty mid-market electric vehicle, the Kia Soul electric vehicle, for our base case. By the time we finished the paper, its battery, I think, was maybe 30 kilowatt hours. That was already pretty below average. So we did some testing to see if you had a longer range EV, like 300 miles perhaps, how much does that change the feasibility of an electric vehicle? And it does certainly reduce the planning complexities, and it does reduce some barriers to EVs in these ride sourcing fleets.
It also connects back to that life cycle issue of, what's the full cycle of the battery production and potential recycling or reuse, I think is going to be a really important element in those changes in technologies as we move forward. Did anybody else want to touch on that one?
I would just say vehicle to grid and vehicle to everything technology is very exciting. The possibility of using your car as a mobile storage has a real potential to be transformative for the grid.
One thing that's happening, which is really interesting too, is there's been some cross-pollination between passenger transport and package delivery too. So, when we talk about shared mobility, we always talk about, multiple passengers getting into the same vehicles, but now there are companies that are doing kind of like this Uber Eats type of thing for package delivery in between trips, and I think that will help as well. And there's some projects in New York City. There's an e-cargo pilot program going on, and so this is something in between the actual scooters and and the pedicabs that you would see doing freight delivery. They're kind of like boxy looking and small, and their future remains uncertain, but I think most cities are going to actually propel them forward, and they are EVs. They're all EVs, and they're like little golf carts that are a little bit higher, and they have cargo space. And I think we're going to see a lot more of those too. So that's another technology improvement.
Which goes hand in hand with changes in human behavior. So it's not only looking at how is technology advancing over the years and how do we model and plan for that, but the number of people ordering things to their homes has just really accelerated over the last couple of years, and how is that going to change moving forward as well?
Thank you. I want to pick up on the conversation Matt Doss had about DNCs partnering with transit agencies. which I think in the short term is a great solution. But do you think in the long term, transit agencies should pivot from fixed route services to more variable route services where they're not spending $1 million or $2 million on a battery electric bus, but instead smaller EV vehicles using AV technology to supplement their operations?
I think they have to. Let's not forget why transit agencies are even considering these partnerships. It's because Uber and Lyft drove their ridership down well before the pandemic happened. And now you got people working from home. People aren't using the subways in some cities because they're not safe. So I really think that the money that they have now, they're already talking about the money coming in from the pandemic relief running out. At that point, they have no choice because we're an ecosystem. And it's just not inherently cost efficient to buy tons of electric buses that run in areas where everybody's not going to have a seat on there, where it's going to be empty buses. There needs to be first and last mile partnerships. And also, someone had mentioned NEMT and paratransit. For years now, I mean, going back into the 2000s, I remember doing a pilot program where we started using e-hail taxis and black cars to do point-to-point for public transit, for wheelchair users and others that are using the public paratransit system. And I think a federally funded study I did showed that on average, the city was spending $60 per ride per disabled individual versus $12 to $15 per ride because of the simple point-to-point aspect of it. Those big vans that you see that carry multiple wheelchair users, they're only because of the inefficiencies of a system that works in between fixed and on demand. It's kind of a hybrid. Depending on the time of day, there's no really good way to optimize it. So there's only 1.5 passengers in any of those four passenger vehicles. So point to point, I think for paratransit has saved New York City Transit tens and tens of millions of dollars over the years, just by taking simply one person from point A to point B. I think when it comes to public transit, I think EVs and building out infrastructure makes sense where they partner and we use these monies strategically, and congestion pricing monies as well. Remember, in a lot of cities, TNCs and taxis, they're all paying money to the competitors, right? I mean, in New York City, taxis and TNCs are in competition with public transit, but they've been paying hundreds of millions of dollars to them, to their competitors. That money needs to come back and help the people. So what I would do is create a mobility hub in underserved transportation deserts where you have EV charging stations that have scooters, mopeds, liveries, Ubers, and they all line up there so that when you come out of the subway station, you're able to complete your trip through the same fare. It all should be subsidized, in my opinion, but barring that, I think some of these companies would be willing to pay transit agencies money to have that curb space so that you can take the train or the bus, and the last mile, I think it's critically important to the system. I think it's really the only way for mobility to move forward, and that's why you see like APTA and all these organizations, they're all focusing on this now. But it's two components, first and last mile, and also the public paratransit, which is a system that's really broken because public transit agencies, their only view is everything has to move as many people as possible in one direction on fixed routes. And that is not what people want. That's why Uber is so successful and Lyft, and why people are using them for their last destination. So I think EV policy has to be built around that. And when we have limited charging stations and infrastructure, we need to strategically place them and work with public transit. So I agree with that gentleman that raised that in the morning, that we should be talking more about public transit getting involved with EV infrastructure outside of the traditional buses and subways.
Thank you.
And then coordinating with the utilities to make sure that you have that energy where you need it for those massive amounts of everybody coming together to do charging. We are at 5 o'clock, so thank you all of the panelists for your interesting talks and questions and answers, and thank you to the audience for joining us.